Most powerful men in the Tudor court came from long, proud lines of noble ancestry. You know, the kind with stained glass family crests, sprawling manors, and great-uncles who passed away gloriously in France with a lance in the spleen. Thomas Cromwell? He came from Putney, and his father wasn't a lord, he was a blacksmith, brewer, and part-time brawler with a reputation for smacking people with hot pokers. Born around 1485, Thomas Cromwell didn't exactly pop out of the womb with a royal scroll in hand. His father, Walter Cromwell, was a man of varied talents, which is a polite way of saying he ran an alehouse and had a drinking problem that occasionally escalated into a court appearance. And while there's a chance young Thomas may have learned something about metallurgy or brewing from dear old Dad, he clearly took one look at the family business and said, "Nope. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep." Tonight, we will explore the topic, why it sucked to be Thomas Cromwell, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Cromwell didn't just run away from home. He ran away from England. Teenage Thomas skipped across the Channel to the European continent, where he began the least glamorous version of the find yourself abroad journey imaginable. No poetry in Tuscany or selfies at the Louvre for him. He allegedly fought as a mercenary in the French army, because nothing says gap year like dodging arrows for a paycheck. Historical accounts suggest he fought at the Battle of Garigliano in Italy in 1503, a name that might sound like a fine Italian wine but was actually a messy, muddy bloodbath. Imagine trying to survive a Renaissance battlefield where your armor is heavy, your boots are soaked, and your commander probably believes that divine intervention is a valid battle strategy. Cromwell survived. That alone made him smarter than half the generals. After putting enough distance between himself and English blacksmithdom, Cromwell started to level up in ways that would have made any RPG player proud. He picked up languages, Latin, French, and Italian. All the essentials if you plan to navigate Europe or just curse in 5 dialects. He learned how to handle money, negotiate contracts, and work with merchant bankers in Italy, basically Tudor Wall Street, minus the coffee and functioning economy. Eventually he made his way to the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, which were a thriving hub of trade, finance, and ideas. While other Englishmen were still debating whether the earth revolved around the sun, Cromwell was hanging out with people who'd already read Erasmus, studied Roman law, and figured out that maybe selling indulgences wasn't a spiritual business model. He soaked up this intellectual energy like a sponge with ambition issues. It's worth pausing to marvel at how rare this kind of education was. Most people in Cromwell's position would have ended up back in England scraping horseshoes or dying from something ridiculous like being out in the rain too long. But Thomas didn't just survive, he thrived. He was clever, charismatic, and dangerously good at adapting. While noble boys back home were learning falconry and swordplay, Cromwell was learning accounting and how to turn a profit from Florentine textile deals. One gave you bragging rights, the other made you indispensable. By the time he returned to England, Cromwell wasn't just some guy from Putney anymore. He had the skills, experience, and connections to climb the social ladder, even if that ladder was half on fire and missing a few rungs. What made Cromwell exceptional wasn't just his intelligence, it was his sheer, unrelenting versatility. He could talk to kings and bankers, read legal documents in Latin, and still probably haggle with a fishmonger over the price of eels. The average Tudor man rose in society the way a cat climbs a tree. Slowly, nervously, and with the looming possibility of falling and embarrassing everyone involved. Cromwell, he was a rocket fueled by grit, brains, and just the right amount of audacity. It didn't matter that he had no noble blood, he had something far more dangerous in the Tudor court: usefulness. And in an era where kings swapped advisors like outfits and noble birth was no guarantee of survival, that made Cromwell a dangerous kind of man. The kind who made things happen, not through war, not through charm, but through paperwork, strategy, and relentless logic. In the shark tank of Tudor, Cromwell didn't just swim, he built the tank, stocked it, and sold tickets to the feeding frenzy. If there was a 16th century version of LinkedIn, Thomas Cromwell's profile would have looked suspiciously like a royal trap. Skills: international banking, contract law, multilingual diplomacy, negotiation under threat of beheading. Endorsements: none. Everyone who tried was mysteriously demoted, but long before he was masterminding church reforms and shuffling queens off the tactful chessboard, Cromwell took a job that would launch him from ambitious nobody to someone everyone pretended not to fear: working for Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Now, Wolsey wasn't just any clergyman. He was the Tudor equivalent of Amazon, Google, and the Pope rolled into one velvet-robed Powerball. He was Henry VIII's right-hand man, Lord Chancellor of England, and the kind of guy who could make or break noble families before finishing breakfast. Cromwell joining his household was like being hired as Jeff Bezos's personal assistant. If Jeff also controlled your soul and the entire legal system. Cromwell started small. Think legal grunt work and handling finances, but quickly impressed Wolsey with something English courtiers rarely had: competence. While other men were whispering Latin prayers, Cromwell was drafting airtight property contracts and organizing land deals so precise they could make a monk weep with joy. And in a world where most court officials were as organized as a dropped salad, Cromwell's brain worked like a filing cabinet with knives. Wolsey soon gave him more authority. One moment Cromwell was managing estate paperwork, and the next he was overseeing entire legal cases, including juicy ones involving aristocrats and misbehaving monasteries. He navigated the murky waters of English property law with the smoothness of a man who knew that any mistake might get him tossed out or tossed in the tower. But Cromwell wasn't just good at his job, he was quietly brilliant. He understood how to blend ambition with obedience, how to advise without overstepping, and most importantly, how to learn while everyone else was grandstanding. You didn't survive the Tudor court by making speeches. You survived by letting the nobleman rant while you quietly rewrote the land grant to your advantage. And Cromwell watched Wolsey very carefully. He saw how the Cardinal bent church rules, swayed Parliament, and casually turned canon law into something more resembling a suggestion. He also learned that power was a tightrope suspended over a pit of crocodiles who wore silk doublets and answered to the name "My Lord." Now, Wolsey had one fatal flaw. He couldn't get Henry VIII what he wanted, and what Henry wanted very badly was a divorce from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn, because apparently the world wasn't going to implode fast enough on its own. Wolsey tried everything: appeals to the Pope, legal loopholes, Latin footnotes written in increasingly desperate ink. Nothing worked. The papal answer was a resounding, "Absolutely not, please stop writing." Cromwell, however, noticed something. While everyone else was still begging the Vatican for permission, he quietly thought, what if we just didn't? That seed of reform, that dangerously modern idea that England didn't have to be spiritually tethered to Rome, would come to full bloom later. But this is where it started. While fetching documents and managing Wolsey's increasingly frantic efforts to avoid becoming yesterday's favourite, unfortunately for Wolsey, the king eventually ran out of patience, as Henry VIII was known to do when faced with anything more complex than lunch. When Wolsey failed to deliver the royal divorce, he was stripped of titles and banished. It was one of the most spectacular downfalls in English tactful history, the kind of fall where you don't just lose your office, you lose your coat of arms, your servants, and your reason to wake up in the morning. And standing just to the side, watching it all unfold with the calm of a man who's read the warning signs, Thomas Cromwell. Now here's where most men would pack up and disappear quietly, maybe open a bookshop in Devon and never talk about court life again. But Cromwell, he pivoted, hard. He took everything he'd learnt, church law, statecraft, negotiation, survival skills, and walked straight into Parliament. No Wolsey, no noble family backing, just him and a resume that read, "Can fix the church, call me." In 1529, Cromwell was elected as a member of Parliament, and in a stunning flex of judo, he began defending the memory of the man who'd just been disgraced, Wolsey. And oddly, it worked. Instead of falling with his boss, Cromwell used the fall to introduce himself as a better version. The same skills but more practical, less pompous, and far more useful to a king who now desperately needed someone to clean up his marital mess. Cromwell's career didn't just survive Wolsey's disaster, it took off, because in the Tudor court, usefulness was a currency more powerful than titles, and Cromwell was now flush with it. He'd seen behind the curtain. He knew how the system ran, and unlike so many nobles, he didn't need prestige to function. He needed only access, leverage, and a monarch who liked results more than ceremony. So when Henry looked around for someone to help him throw a royal tantrum in legal form, Cromwell was already at the front of the line, sleeves rolled up, ink-stained fingers ready, and a plan to break England free from Rome. Next stop, revolution. The Catholic Church in the 16th century was less a religious institution and more a multinational empire, one that just happened to run on incense, Latin, and guilt. At the head of this spiritual juggernaut sat the Pope, God's representative on earth, supreme authority over Christendom, and the man who had one very annoying habit, saying no to Henry VIII. Henry wanted a divorce. The Pope wouldn't give it to him, and the longer the argument dragged on, the more furious Henry became, which, for everyone in England, was like watching a bear try to unlock a door, frustrating, loud, and guaranteed to end with someone getting mauled. Enter Thomas Cromwell, who didn't just solve the problem, he flipped the table entirely. Now most people in Henry's orbit were still clinging to the hope that Rome might change its mind if they sent just one more letter, one more diplomat, or one more emotional appeal about how Henry's suffering conscience simply couldn't handle marriage to Catherine of Aragon anymore. Never mind that he was mainly suffering from not being able to marry Anne Boleyn fast enough. Cromwell, meanwhile, had a different thought. What if the Pope didn't get a say? It was the kind of idea that made most Englishmen either gasp, faint, or check for lightning. But Cromwell wasn't religious in the traditional rosary-clutching, papal-kissing sense. He was religious like an engineer, focused on how the system worked, where it could be optimized, and whether it could be quietly dismantled and rebuilt without anyone realizing until it was too late. And so, in a series of moves that can only be described as constitutional chaos in slow motion, Cromwell began reshaping the very foundation of English religion. First, he pushed for laws in Parliament that slowly stripped away the Pope's authority in England. One law removed Rome's control over clerical appointments. Another cut off payments to the Vatican. It was like watching someone slowly unfriend the Pope on every platform. Blocked on Facebook, unfollowed on Instagram, excommunicated in real life. But the real hammer came in 1534, when Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, the legal equivalent of turning the entire country upside down and saying, This is fine. The Act declared Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively booting the Pope off his throne, at least in English territory, and replacing him with a king who had a history of chopping off the heads of people who annoyed him. Spiritual leadership had officially become a health risk, and Cromwell, he wasn't just some bystander clapping from the sidelines. He drafted the laws, he lobbied Parliament, he shaped the language, smoothed the laws, and spun the narrative until it sounded like common sense. Why should a foreign priest in Rome control English souls, he asked. A compelling argument, especially when backed by royal pressure and the occasional armed guard standing nearby. Cromwell's legal gymnastics didn't just break with Rome, they rewrote England. The church and the state were now fused together like two deer locked in antlers, and the king was suddenly wearing a new hat labeled God's local manager. It was brilliant, it was terrifying, and it was exactly what Henry wanted. Of course, this didn't go over smoothly with everyone. Some clergymen resisted, some noble families clutched their rosaries like Tudor stress balls, and Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, famously said, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," before getting the very Cromwellian reward for disagreeing with royal policy, a chopped-off head. But Cromwell wasn't bothered. He kept moving forward, methodical, ruthless, and astonishingly effective. He created new government offices to manage the church's affairs, appointed loyal bishops, and even established a propaganda network to explain the spiritual advantages of having your soul taxed by the crown instead of Rome. Because nothing says divine truth like a well-placed pamphlet. The payoff? Promotion. Big one. Cromwell became vicegerent in spirituals, a made-up title that roughly translated to second only to the king when it comes to religion, so please don't make eye contact. He was now the de facto overseer of the Church of England, a blacksmith's son turned national architect of heresy, depending on who you asked. This wasn't just a power grab, it was a rebranding campaign for an entire nation. Overnight, Cromwell had changed the source of religious authority, redirected rivers of church money into royal coffers, and created a system where questioning the king's marriage could get you labelled a traitor and a blasphemer. 2-for-1 execution special. What's more, Cromwell achieved all this without being a priest, a bishop, or even particularly pious. He did it through laws, loopholes, and logistics. He turned canon law into scrap paper and replaced it with state documents signed in triplicate, and the most astonishing part, he made it look like this was always how things were supposed to work. So yes, Thomas Cromwell didn't just burn bridges with Rome. He lit them with the Pope's own candles, waved from across the river, and started charging tolls to anyone trying to swim back. The Reformation was underway. England would never be the same. And Cromwell? He'd just earned himself a front-row seat to history, and eventually to a very sharp blade. In the world of Tudor politics, friendships aged like milk, and no one curdled a royal relationship quite like Thomas Cromwell when he decided Anne Boleyn needed to go. This was no mere personal squabble. It was a full-blown spreadsheet-level cloak-and-dagger campaign. Cromwell didn't just help orchestrate Anne's rise, he installed the throne ramp, but once it was clear she was wobbling at the top, he removed the screws and smiled politely. Let's rewind. In the early 1530s, Cromwell and Anne Boleyn were two sharp minds on the same cutting edge. Both were reformers, both wanted a break from Rome, and both believed England needed to modernize its religious institutions, albeit for slightly different reasons. Anne thought the church needed cleansing. Cromwell thought the church needed inventorying, auditing and repackaging into a budget-friendly, crown-approved model. Same hymn sheet, different margins. At first, they were allies. Anne had Henry's ear and occasionally his heart, while Cromwell had the king's trust in paperwork and property. They both wanted to topple the Catholic establishment, and together they steamrolled over monasteries, clerical power, and several bishops who dared to sneeze in Latin. But then things started to shift. Anne wasn't exactly shy about using her influence, and she had enemies, lots of them. Her sharp tongue, evangelical fervor, and general refusal to play the submissive queen made her about as popular at court as a vegetarian at a Tudor pig roast. Even Cromwell started to find her exhausting, tactfully inconvenient, diplomatically dangerous, and personally infuriating. The final crack came in the form of a foreign policy disaster. Anne wanted England to align more closely with Protestant Germany. Cromwell, ever the cautious strategist, favoured maintaining ties with Catholic Europe, especially Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had a temper, an army, and a serious dislike of Anne Boleyn, who, let's not forget, helped Henry ditch his aunt Catherine of Aragon. So now we had opposing camps, Team Anne versus Team Thomas, and here's where Cromwell showed his true genius, not in battle but in bureaucratic bloodletting. He didn't rush to Henry screaming witch or treason, he simply waited for the Queen to slip, and slip she did. Anne failed to produce a male heir, suffered miscarriages, and watched Henry's eye wander toward the quiet and demure Jane Seymour. Suddenly, Anne's throne wasn't as bolted down as she'd thought. Cromwell began gathering intelligence like a squirrel before winter. Discreet conversations intercepted letters, rumors whispered in hallways and hinted at by enemies. He didn't even need solid proof. He needed something Henry could believe without asking too many questions. The result? A jaw-droppingly creative set of charges: adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. Basically a full episode of Game of Thrones compressed into court records. Anne was accused of seducing multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn. Even in Tudor England, that raised eyebrows. Cromwell handled it all. The interrogations, the trials, the PR spin, the accused men, some likely innocent, some merely unlucky, were tortured, coerced, and executed. Anne's trial was a theatrical masterpiece of predetermined guilt. The jury was packed with her enemies, the evidence was shaky, and the atmosphere was thick with royal disapproval. The Queen stood alone, betrayed by the very machinery she'd once helped operate. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded by a French swordsman, an imported luxury, because Henry wanted a clean cut and perhaps some continental flair to soften the optics. Cromwell, notably, stayed behind the curtain. No grand proclamations, no chest-thumping, just paperwork, silence, and a new queen already in the waiting room. Why did he do it? Was it vengeance? Pragmatism? The truth is likely a cocktail of all three, shaken with a dash of self-preservation. Cromwell saw Anne as a sinking ship, and unlike most Tudor nobles, he'd built his entire career by knowing when to jump. In removing Anne, he not only aligned himself with Henry's shifting affections, but also cleared the way for his own influence to expand. Of course, karma has a schedule in the Tudor timeline, but that's a later chapter. For now, Cromwell was riding high with Henry's praise, new titles, and a bigger role in shaping England's future. He had demonstrated yet again that in a world of swords and whispers, the most dangerous weapon was a well-placed signature and a knack for knowing exactly when to smile and nod. If Cromwell had a LinkedIn update for the year 1536, it might have read, "Current role, Chief Liquidator of Sacred Institutions," because by this point Cromwell had graduated from backroom and king whispering to full-blown national economic reformation, the kind where abbots start sweating and monks suddenly remember they've got pressing business in Calais. Let's rewind just a bit. The church in England wasn't just about incense, Latin and gilt, it was a juggernaut of property and wealth. At the start of the 1530s, monasteries and abbeys owned over a quarter of the land in England. That's a lot of land not paying rent to the king. Worse yet, it meant the real estate market was being hogged by pious men who spent their days chanting instead of contributing to the royal piggy bank. You can see why Henry VIII started eyeing the monasteries like a hungry man eyeing someone else's meat pie. Enter Cromwell, part lawyer, part bureaucrat, part economic hitman. After England's break from Rome, Cromwell found himself in a prime position to handle what came next, and what came next was a full-scale, ecclesiastical foreclosure. He was appointed vicegerent in spirituals, which is basically a fancy Tudor way of saying the king's holy hatchet man. His mission, survey every monastic institution in England and determine just how sinful and profitable they were. Cromwell unleashed a small army of royal inspectors who carried out what was called the Valor Ecclesiasticus, a nationwide audit of the church's assets. If that sounds dry, remember this was Tudor England. Audit meant poking into every priory, abbey and convent, asking nosy questions like how much gold is in that chalice and exactly how many monks are sleeping in that wine cellar. Of course, the reports that came back were shocking, or more accurately, shockingly convenient. The monks were accused of all sorts of indecencies, drunkenness, gambling, secret wives, embezzlement, and in one case, allegedly teaching a pig to sing hymns. Whether these tales were fact, fiction, or state-sponsored smear campaigns didn't matter. Cromwell had what he needed, justification. And then came the hammer. Between 1536 and 1541, England witnessed the largest government seizure of property in its history. Over 800 monasteries were dissolved. Their lands were confiscated, their treasures carted off, their libraries, and this still hurts, were often burned or used as kindling by local fishmongers. And the monks, given the choice between a modest pension and a fast track to martyrdom, most took the pension. But Cromwell wasn't just shutting things down, he was also turning this chaos into cash. The monastic lands were sold to Henry's loyal nobles and social climbers at bargain rates. It was a win-win. The crown got a quick infusion of wealth, and the nobility got richer and more loyal practically overnight. The Tudor aristocracy, many of whom had never set foot inside a cloister before, suddenly became proud owners of former abbeys, now rebranded as rustic retreats with Gothic flair. Cromwell naturally took his cut, not in the form of backroom bribes, well, not openly, but in elevated status, royal favour, and a fattened purse. His fingerprints were on every deed, every sale, every church door that was nailed shut in the name of reform. He had, in essence, nationalised the divine. But this wasn't just about wealth, it was also about ideology. Cromwell was a sincere reformer, at least by Tudor standards. He saw monastic institutions as bloated, corrupt relics of medieval superstition. He wanted a leaner, more scripture-focused England, one where the Bible was in English, not Latin, and the church answered to the king, not to some pointy-hatted Italian in Rome. The Dissolution was part religious purification, part flex, and part Tudor Black Friday sale. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Uprisings like the Pilgrimage of Grace saw thousands of angry northerners protesting the closures, demanding the return of their monasteries and traditional faith. But Cromwell wasn't one to be moved by rural sentiment or peasant tears. His solution was simple: send in troops, crush the rebellion, and move on with the next auction. By the early 1540s, Cromwell had helped turn England's spiritual map inside out. The monasteries that had once stood for centuries as centres of learning, charity, and community were now sheep farms and gentlemen's estates. It was the end of an era and the beginning of Cromwell's high-stakes gamble with fate, because while Henry loved money, he didn't love forever, and Cromwell's rise was starting to cast a long, jealous shadow. But for now, Cromwell was on top, sipping the metaphorical communion wine from a golden chalice he probably listed in an inventory report 6 months earlier. If Thomas Cromwell had a Tudor-era LinkedIn endorsement section, it would have read something like, detail-oriented, ruthlessly efficient, turns chaos into color-coded charts. While most of his contemporaries were busy playing courtly chess with daggers behind their backs, Cromwell was in a room somewhere, reorganizing the kingdom's filing cabinet by force of will, law, and sheer paperwork. By the 1530s, England's government looked like a medieval closet, overstuffed, vaguely damp, and dangerously close to collapse every time someone opened the door. The system was a patchwork of personal influence, customary practices, and scribes with impressive calligraphy but zero consistency. Enter Cromwell, part legal eagle, part spreadsheet incarnate. He wasn't just interested in power, he wanted systems, functional, replicable, streamlined systems. Cromwell's bureaucratic revolution began in earnest when he started consolidating royal authority during Henry VIII's heady break from Rome. Power was no longer just about whispering in the king's ear. It was about the ability to keep track of land, titles, taxes, religious houses, inheritance claims, and where every penny went. And if there was one thing Cromwell hated, it was money unaccounted for. His first major contribution, centralizing administration, instead of relying on nobles and regional officers who were often more loyal to their own pockets than the crown, Cromwell worked to bring authority back under the royal umbrella. He expanded the role of the Privy Council, a body that actually began to function as a decision-making institution rather than a collection of aging aristocrats snoring through their responsibilities. He also created specialized departments, novel for their time, now the basis of modern governance. There was the Court of Augmentations to handle ex-monastic wealth, the Court of First Fruits and Tenths to collect revenue formerly going to the Pope, and the Court of Wards and Liveries for managing estates of minors and royal wards. These were all administrative innovations that turned money into government policy, not just royal lunch money. Cromwell's reforms extended into legal processes too. He didn't just push laws through Parliament, he made Parliament work. He understood how to draft clear statutes, how to coordinate legislative agendas, and how to ensure enforcement. Think of it this way: before Cromwell, Parliament was a medieval think tank with poor time management. After Cromwell, it had agendas, drafts, schedules, and most scandalously follow-up memos. Another key innovation? Record keeping. Cromwell institutionalized the use of paper trails, charters, property rights, legal rulings, ecclesiastical decisions, everything now needed documentation. If it wasn't written down, it didn't exist. This wasn't just bureaucratic fastidiousness. In a world where power could evaporate with a whisper or be fabricated by rumor, Cromwell's records were shields, swords, and insurance policies all at once. He trained and employed a growing army of clerks and administrators, some of them commoners like himself, who were literate, efficient, and loyal to the system, rather than any noble patron. These were the Excel pivot table jockeys of Tudor England, wearing robes and ink-stained fingers instead of neckties. And here's the kicker, he made money doing all of this, not just personally, although he did quite well for himself, but for the crown. His bureaucratic overhaul increased revenue, improved tax collection, and ensured the crown had legal control over the enormous lands recently confiscated from the monasteries. All those gold crosses and velvet altar cloths, catalogued, priced, and sold to Henry's friends with an official receipt. Yet Cromwell's paperwork wasn't just about efficiency, it was about control. The more you write down, the more you can prove, dispute, or manipulate. The new bureaucracy allowed Cromwell to tighten the crown's grip on England in a way no sword ever could. It was government by ink, law, and meticulous detail. Of course, this made him insufferable to the old-school nobles. Imagine being a duke who inherited his title from a man who once sacked a French city, and now you're being asked by Cromwell's clerk to fill out a 5-page form before you can collect rent from your tenants. It didn't go over well. But Cromwell didn't care. He wasn't in this for popularity. He was in it for power. And if he had to bury that power under a mountain of parchment, so be it. In the end, Cromwell's bureaucratic genius transformed the English state. He made it more centralized, more professional, and yes, more annoying, but also more stable, for a while anyway. Because as we'll soon see, all the footnotes in the world can't save you when the king gets bored. In the long, glittering resume of Thomas Cromwell, legal mastermind, monastery collector, political axe-thrower, there's one bullet point that glows with particular awkwardness: matchmaker disastrous, because for all his talents, Cromwell's attempt at playing Tudor Cupid resulted in one of history's most painfully mismatched royal marriages, and ultimately, in Cromwell's own catastrophic fall from grace. Let's rewind to 1539. Henry VIII was between queens. Anne Boleyn had lost her head, literally. Jane Seymour had tragically died after giving birth to Edward VI. And Henry, now in his 40s and increasingly resembling a gouty boiled ham in tights, was once again in the market for a wife. But this time, the stakes were bigger than romance. England was now a Protestant island in a very Catholic sea, and Henry needed allies fast. Enter Cromwell. Ever the strategic overachiever, he knew England needed an alliance, especially with rising Protestant powers on the continent. And the Duchy of Cleves, a modest but strategically situated German territory, seemed like just the right partner. Even better, the Duke had an unmarried sister, Anne of Cleves. Anne was Protestant. She was from a good family. She was reportedly demure, modest, and fluent in standing still during formal portraits. What more could Henry want? To seal the deal, Cromwell commissioned none other than Hans Holbein the Younger, court painter extraordinaire, to travel to Cleves and capture Anne's likeness. Holbein, either a diplomatic genius or a man who didn't want to lose his head, painted Anne in the most flattering Instagram-filtered light possible. The result was an elegant, serene, utterly appealing portrait. Henry took one look and decided this was the one. Sight unseen, he agreed to marry her. Now, let's pause to consider just how deeply awkward blind dates are in the best of times. Add to that international diplomacy, royal ego, and a history of wives mysteriously disappearing, and you have a recipe for emotional disaster. When Anne of Cleves finally arrived in England, Henry, giddy and expecting a flesh-and-blood version of Holbein's masterpiece, disguised himself badly and went to surprise her at Rochester. He was expecting sparks. What he got, by his account, was a woman who didn't recognize him, didn't speak English, and apparently did not match the portrait in any favorable dimension. Henry was not amused. He allegedly called her a Flanders mare, which, given his own appearance at the time, was some serious pot and kettle energy. But he was stuck. The marriage was politically important, the alliance was necessary, and the ceremony was scheduled. So on January 6, 1540, Henry married Anne of Cleves with all the enthusiasm of someone being wed to a damp towel. Things only got worse from there. Henry made it widely known in the most unromantic way possible that the marriage had not been consummated. He reportedly told his doctors he found Anne's body repulsive, and Cromwell, who had championed the match, found himself increasingly cornered. This wasn't just a failed date, it was a full-scale romantic debacle with international consequences. Henry, ever obsessed with male pride and image, blamed Cromwell for the whole affair. Never mind that Cromwell had done his job, secure a Protestant alliance, and stabilize England's position in Europe. Henry didn't like Anne, therefore someone had to pay. Cromwell tried to fix it. He pushed for the marriage to be annulled, which Anne wisely didn't resist. She agreed to the annulment and walked away with a generous settlement, 2 estates, and a solid retirement plan, a rare happy ending in Henry's romantic history. But for Cromwell, the damage was done. His enemies at court, especially the powerful Howard family, saw their moment. They whispered in Henry's ear that Cromwell had overreached, that he had forced the marriage, that he was too Protestant, too powerful, too everything. By summer, Cromwell was arrested for treason. So yes, this was the Tudor version of setting your boss up on a date, the boss hating it, and then firing you so hard that you end up in the Tower of London, the most brutal HR policy in royal history. In hindsight, the Anne of Cleves episode is a perfect encapsulation of the risks Cromwell constantly ran, betting everything on his ability to read the king's mind, and occasionally getting it spectacularly wrong. It wasn't about love, really. It was about tactics, and in Henry's court, missteps didn't end in awkward small talk. They ended in scaffolds. Still, it's hard not to feel a little sympathy for Cromwell here. He was playing 3D chess with a man who sometimes flipped the board because he didn't like the piece's haircuts. In the grand scheme of Tudor politics, Cromwell's matchmaking failure was less a sin and more a reminder that no matter how powerful you were, your head always belonged to the king. And as it turns out, Holbein might have needed a filter warning label. One moment he's running England, the next he's starring in a very exclusive production of Guess Who's Getting Executed. If Thomas Cromwell's rise was meteoric, his fall was the medieval equivalent of a nosedive from a burning zeppelin, fast, dramatic, and full of noblemen gleefully lighting the match. For a man who'd spent years surviving court intrigue, dismantling centuries-old institutions, and organizing the royal marriage market like an ambitious Tudor wedding planner, he should have known that no one stays in King Henry VIII's good graces forever, especially if you embarrass him with a German bride he describes as looking like a Flanders mare. By the late 1530s, Cromwell was still at the top, Lord Privy Seal, Vicegerent in Spirituals, the Earl of Essex. He had more titles than Henry had wives, which, in fairness, was a moving target. But titles in Henry's court were like antique swords, sharp, ornamental, and liable to get you impaled if you didn't hold them correctly. What sealed Cromwell's fate wasn't just one thing, it was everything. He had centralized power in his own hands so effectively that the old nobility, particularly the Duke of Norfolk and his faction, started looking around and going, "Wait, why is the blacksmith's kid in charge of everything?" Cromwell, a man of humble origin, was surrounded by enemies born into coats of arms, and convinced that divine right came with a family tree longer than the Domesday Book. Cromwell's aggressive reforms, his bureaucracy, and his systematic land redistribution made him deeply unpopular with the aristocracy. To them, he wasn't modernizing England, he was bulldozing their playground. And once the Anne of Cleves disaster gave his enemies an opening, they pounced with the grace of a starving hawk. Enter Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, professional schemer, aristocratic snob, and the kind of man who probably had his family tree embroidered onto his bedsheets. Norfolk loathed Cromwell's upstart swagger and resented every ounce of influence the man had. with the Cleves marriage bombing harder than a Tudor theatre performance with no plague jokes, Norfolk whispered in the right ears, namely Henry's, and Henry, ever the emotional roller coaster with a crown, felt duped. Cromwell had promised him a beautiful, strategic bride. Instead, he got what he claimed was a fat German woman who smelled strange and made him want to rejoin the monastery he'd personally destroyed. The court turned cold. Once the king's most trusted advisor, Cromwell now found himself on the outside of conversations and the wrong end of side-eyes. Rumours swirled that he was overreaching, that he harboured Lutheran sympathies, that he'd enriched himself through the spoils of monastic destruction. It didn't matter if the charges were true, they were useful. In June 1540, the hammer fell. Cromwell was arrested during a council meeting, mid-discussion, with barely a moment to protest. 1 minute he was signing documents, the next he was being dragged off by guards in what must have felt like the worst surprise party in history. His titles were stripped, his allies disappeared faster than the monastic gold he'd once redistributed, and to rub extra Tudor salt into the wound, his enemies orchestrated a humiliating charge of treason and heresy. Cromwell, who had delivered England from the Pope, restructured the government, and paved the way for Protestantism, was now being painted as a traitor and closet heretic. Irony wasn't dead, it just wore a powdered wig and had a grudge. From his cell in the Tower of London, Cromwell wrote desperate letters to Henry, pleading for mercy. He called himself a poor worm, hoping that grovelling might trigger the king's mercy reflex. But Henry wasn't feeling sentimental, not after the Anne of Cleves debacle, not after years of hearing that Cromwell was getting a little too comfortable in the driver's seat. On July 28, 1540, the very same day Henry married his next wife, the teenage Catherine Howard, Norfolk's niece, because of course it was, Cromwell was dragged to the scaffold at Tower Hill. His executioner botched the job, needing multiple swings. It was a gruesome ending for a man who had once orchestrated the fates of queens and the structure of a nation. He had risen from blacksmith's son to Earl of Essex, and now headless he was just another cautionary tale in Henry VIII's revolving door of casualties. But Cromwell didn't vanish quietly into the footnotes. His reforms, his ideas, and his paperwork, the paperwork outlived him. Even the nobles who cheered his fall couldn't undo the bureaucratic machine he'd built. They just took over driving it. In the end, Thomas Cromwell's story is proof that power in Tudor England was like handling unstable gunpowder, incredibly useful. But one misstep, and you're the fireworks display. By July 1540, Thomas Cromwell, former Chief Minister, Earl of Essex, Master of the Rolls, Lord Privy Seal, and General Puppet Master of Henry VIII's policies, was sitting in the Tower of London, and not in the admire the view of the Thames way, but in the you're about to lose your head way. His journey from blacksmith's son to the second most powerful man in England had ended not with thunder, but with a dull parliamentary mutter and a heavily inked warrant. The man who had micromanaged the kingdom into bureaucratic submission now had no defence, no allies, and crucially no time. Let's be clear, Cromwell's trial made kangaroo courts look like Harvard law. Officially, he was charged with treason, heresy, corruption, and just about any crime short of witchcraft. Give them another week, they might have added that too. In reality, the charges were as coherent as a drunk bard trying to recite legalese. Most damning of all, he had lost the king's favour, and in Tudor England, that was the only crime that mattered. The speed of the proceedings was practically athletic. Parliament passed a Bill of Attainder, essentially a fast track to execution that skips little annoyances like evidence or defence. Cromwell didn't get a trial, a chance to plead his case, or even a dramatic monologue. He was simply stripped of his titles, lands, and dignity. Imagine you go from running the country on Monday to traitor number 1 by Tuesday, and the only explanation is that the boss is in a bad mood because of his divorce. Henry VIII's anger wasn't just political, it was personal. Cromwell had pushed the Anne of Cleves marriage like a used car salesman with a quota, and Henry, who expected a German goddess, got what he described as a Flanders mare. Cromwell had staked his standing on that union. When it flopped, the vultures circled. The Duke of Norfolk, Long jealous of Cromwell's power and increasingly irritated that a low-born nobody had the king's ear, seized the moment. He orchestrated the smear campaign with the same elegance as a bar fight in a pigsty. Alongside a few other conservative nobles and religious hardliners, Norfolk painted Cromwell as a dangerous Protestant sympathizer, a traitor to tradition, and a man plotting to overthrow the king himself, because that's totally what Cromwell, the man who worked tirelessly to keep Henry in charge of everything, would do. Cromwell was arrested during a council meeting because why wait for subtlety when you can do it mid-agenda? He was hauled off in disbelief, reportedly saying, "This then is my reward for faithful service." And if that doesn't scream 17 years of work experience flushed down the oubliette, I don't know what does. While in the Tower, he wrote desperate letters to Henry. He begged for mercy, pleaded for understanding, and reminded the king how loyal he had been through every twist of the Tudor soap opera. His final letter practically sparkled with humility. He didn't protest his innocence loudly. He didn't scheme an escape. He just asked not to be forgotten as a faithful servant. Henry predictably ignored it. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led to Tower Hill. The same day, ironically, Henry married Catherine Howard, a teenager whose presence in the king's life had helped seal Cromwell's fate. It was the political equivalent of holding a wedding reception at your ex's funeral. As was custom, Cromwell gave a final speech. Unlike many others, he didn't rage against the injustice. He praised the king, declared himself a sinner, and accepted his fate. Some say he hoped that dying humbly might spare his family. Others believe he'd simply run out of cards to play. And then came the execution, performed not with clean precision but with a botched swing. His executioner, apparently better suited to cutting vegetables than statesman, took multiple strikes to finish the job. It was an undignified end for a man who had once choreographed the kingdom's every move. A final punctuation mark that was more splatter than period. Cromwell's head was placed on a spike on London Bridge, a grim monument to the volatility of Tudor politics. One day you're King Henry's favourite chess piece, the next you're decorating the skyline with your jaw slack and your eyes shut. Ironically, just weeks later, Henry began to regret Cromwell's death. In typical Henry fashion, remorse arrived fashionably late and completely useless. He blamed his advisors, questioned the evidence, and missed the man who had made his chaos manageable. But by then, Cromwell was beyond apology, just one more brilliant, controversial figure whose loyalty couldn't outlast a royal tantrum, and so ended the life of Thomas Cromwell. Not with a rebellion or a scandal, but with paperwork, politics, and a very bad haircut. Thomas Cromwell may have died on the scaffold, but his ghost haunted English politics, like a very organized poltergeist. Sure, the man lost his head literally, but not before he rewired the kingdom so thoroughly that even those who wanted to forget him had to live inside the machine he built. If history is a ledger, Cromwell's entries are still being audited. Let's start with the obvious. Cromwell wasn't just some court climber with a talent for legalese and playing yes-man to a monarch with a god complex. He was an institutional juggernaut, a man who took England's medieval spaghetti bowl of overlapping authorities, exemptions, and gentlemen with fancy seals, and turned it into something approaching a functioning state. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't gentle, and it definitely wasn't subtle, but it worked. His religious reforms alone shifted the tectonic plates of European power. Thanks to Cromwell, the Church of England wasn't just a papal divorce loophole. It became a Protestant-leaning engine of state power. When he pushed the dissolution of the monasteries, it wasn't just about the cash. Though, let's be honest, the cash helped. It was about realigning loyalty. Monks and abbots who once bowed to Rome now bowed to the crown, or packed up their sandals and hit the unemployment line. The result? A radically reshaped religious landscape and a king who no longer needed to ask the Pope for permission slips. But Cromwell's real genius wasn't just breaking things, it was replacing them. He didn't just pull the church out of Roman orbit. He built the bureaucratic scaffolding to keep the whole thing from falling over. His reforms created record-keeping systems, tax assessments, and legal protocols that look suspiciously like the DNA of modern governance. He made things official, painfully official. Before Cromwell, you might run a county because your granddad's cousin won a jousting match. After Cromwell, you needed documentation, a stamp, and possibly 3 witnesses. Even after his execution, his ideas proved maddeningly persistent. Henry VIII, who had tossed Cromwell aside like a bad haircut, kept using the systems he created. The Church of England remained. The streamlined government continued. Future monarchs leaned harder into the playbook Cromwell had drafted, not because they liked him, but because it worked. And perhaps most ironically, the noblemen who helped orchestrate Cromwell's downfall soon discovered they'd created a monster, not Cromwell, but the very centralized power structure he left behind. By weakening the aristocracy and strengthening the monarchy, Cromwell ensured that kings and queens could rule with far less input from squabbling dukes and earls. The people who cheered his fall were now taking orders from the very machine they'd let him build. In many ways, Cromwell was ahead of his time, a modern political operator in an era when most government officials still thought paperwork was something you wiped your mouth with after a roast swan feast. He understood systems. He understood control. He understood that you didn't need to shout to rule. You just needed to hold the pen that wrote the rules. His legacy is as much contradiction as accomplishment. To Protestants, he was a hero of reform. To Catholics, a vandal with a title. To bureaucrats, he was a pioneer. To nobles, a cautionary tale. To history nerds, a goldmine. And yet Cromwell remains one of the most tragically human figures in Tudor history. He rose not by birth but by brilliance. He played the game better than anyone until he didn't. His downfall wasn't due to lack of talent, but an overabundance of trust in a king with the emotional stability of a barrel fire. In the end, Cromwell became a footnote in the very system he designed, one whose ghost lurks in every civil servant's office and every government ledger. If modern Britain owes anyone a thank you, or maybe a begrudging nod, it's the man who created the blueprint and paid for it with his neck. So the next time you fill out a form in triplicate, or wonder why a church service feels slightly less Roman and a bit more bureaucratic, remember Thomas Cromwell. He didn't just change the game, he reprogrammed the entire scoreboard, and then got tackled by his own team. Long before Ethiopia became a coffee-fueled tourist fantasy, or the darling of ancient astronaut theorists, it was home to one of the greatest kingdoms you've probably never heard of, Axom. And no, it's not just a cool Scrabble word. This was a real-deal, gold-minted, trade-booming, stele-building civilization that decided to set up shop in a corner of Africa that looks like it was hand-picked for historical greatness. Spoiler, it kind of was. Let's start with the location, because in ancient geopolitics, location wasn't just everything. It was the entire empire starter pack. Axom was perched in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, right next to the Red Sea, and across from what was then the power-packed kingdoms of South Arabia. To the north, Egypt. To the east, the Arabian Peninsula. To the south, resources, and to the west, even more resources. It was the ancient world's equivalent of being neighbors with Amazon, Google, and a spice bazaar. But Axom didn't begin as an empire. No, it began more humbly, probably as a cluster of farming communities tapping into the lush highland soils. Think barley, wheat, cattle, and honey, the basics you'd need to build a civilization and impress your neighbors at potlucks. By around 100 CE, Axom had already started asserting itself, but if you dig beneath the surface, quite literally, you'll find roots that go centuries deeper. Archaeological digs suggest complex societies were present here as far back as 400 BCE. Now, here's where things get spicy. Axom didn't grow in a vacuum. It borrowed, blended, and boldly absorbed from South Arabian culture, especially the Sabaeans, a wealthy kingdom from what's now Yemen. These folks crossed the Red Sea for trade, colonization, or just curiosity, hard to say when boats were involved, and brought with them their alphabet, architectural styles, and let's be honest, a big helping of swagger. One look at Axomite ruins and you'll spot Sabaean fingerprints all over the place. Stepped platforms, stone inscriptions, and temples that scream, "We copied this, but we made it cooler." But Axom wasn't content being just another knockoff. It took those influences and built a distinctly African civilization with its own flavor, part Arabian, part Nile Valley, part local innovation, and 100% underrated. Which brings us to the matter of kings, because every great ancient civilization needs a list of impressively named rulers to confuse historians. Axomite royalty didn't just show up, they emerged with legends and lineages wrapped in myth. One tradition claims the rulers descended from Menelik I, the alleged son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether or not this was genealogical reality, or the greatest PR stunt of the 4th century BCE, it worked. It gave the early Axomites a powerful mythos, our bloodlines basically biblical. But while the legends kept the nobles busy telling stories, the farmers, merchants, and stoneworkers were building the kingdom from the ground up. Literally, one stone at a time. By the turn of the 1st century CE, Axom was transitioning from being a regional chiefdom to a full-fledged state. Urban centers began to emerge, none more important than Axom city itself, which became the nucleus of power. Temples, palaces, and early versions of the kingdom's soon-to-be iconic stelae, those giant stone obelisks we'll definitely talk more about later, but not in this chapter, promise, began popping up. And here's a fun nerd fact. Axom had its own written language, a form of gears, one of the oldest Semitic languages still in liturgical use today. Think of gears as the ancient equivalent of Latin, except not dead, and still chanted in Ethiopian Orthodox churches with excellent acoustics. The script was sharp, distinct, and uniquely Axomite. No borrowed alphabets from Egypt or Greece here. It gave the kingdom a way to record royal proclamations, trade transactions, and presumably the world's earliest passive-aggressive tax documents. This wasn't just a society with strong kings and stonemasons. It was administratively organized, culturally vibrant, and geopolitically aware. And while much of the ancient world was busy fending off Roman tax collectors or dodging Mongolian scouts, Axom was quietly expanding its influence, growing fields, forging alliances, and turning dusty mountain ridges into centers of power. By the end of this chapter in Axom's story, it hadn't yet become the empire that would rival Rome, Persia, or Byzantium, but the pieces were firmly on the board, with fertile land, a smart use of borrowed culture, a budding port trade, and kings who could spin a good origin myth. The Kingdom of Axom was ready to step out of the shadows and onto the world stage. And while many empires rise with a clang and a bang, Axom began with something even more dangerous: potential. While the Romans were busy conquering Gaul and yelling in Latin, and the Chinese were perfecting the art of bureaucracy, the Kingdom of Axom was quietly turning itself into one of the ancient world's most successful business empires, not with armies, but with commerce, coinage, and a suspiciously efficient supply of frankincense and giraffes. That's right, giraffes. Because nothing says world power like mailing a long-necked herbivore across the Red Sea. Let's set the scene. It's the first few centuries of the Common Era, and the ancient world economy is humming. Silk is drifting west from China. Roman silver is spilling east. Indian spices are flavoring everything. And gold, oh, gold is absolutely everywhere if you know where to look. The Red Sea and Indian Ocean are not barriers, they're highways. And Axom parked itself at one of the best toll booths in history, right along the coast of what's now Eritrea, sat Adulis, Axom's gateway to the world. It was a bustling port city, full of noise, camels, shouting sailors, stacks of goods, and the subtle scent of economic dominance. Adulis wasn't just a backwater dock, it was a cosmopolitan trade hub, the kind of place where you could hear half a dozen languages before breakfast, and possibly get trampled by a rhinoceros being loaded onto a ship bound for India. Yes, again, giraffes, elephants, and rhinos were some of Axom's most exotic exports. These weren't just animals, they were status symbols for foreign rulers, particularly in India and Rome, where a well-placed giraffe in your royal courtyard said, "Yes, I am better than you." Axumite merchants knew this, and they charged accordingly. Exotic animals became luxury goods, the living, snorting version of Rolex watches. But it wasn't all hoofed pageantry. Axum made serious money from ivory, elephant tusks carved into furniture, jewelry, and really aggressive back scratchers. It also exported gold, mined from the Ethiopian highlands, and frankincense and myrrh, the two most biblical substances in history, used in religious rituals, perfumes, and probably ancient wellness fads involving goat yoga and crystals. And in return, the imports were just as juicy. From Rome came wine, glassware, metal tools, and fine fabrics, the kind of stuff that made you look rich, even if your house was still mostly made of mud. From India, spices, cotton, and silk drifted in on monsoon winds. From Arabia, horses, incense, and weapons found their way into Axumite markets. It was a shopping mall the size of an empire, and Axum was the store manager with a really sharp inventory system. Now, how do we know all of this? Because someone, bless their bureaucratic heart, wrote it down. Enter the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, not a Harry Potter spin-off, but rather a 1st century CE Greek travel and trade manual for merchants brave or greedy enough to sail the coasts of East Africa and Arabia. Think of it as the Lonely Planet guide for Roman-era sea captains who wanted to know where to buy the best ivory, where to avoid pirates, and which local kings were more into bartering than stabbing. The Periplus name drops Adulis and Axum as major players, noting their exports, trade habits, and even diplomatic behavior. And when an ancient Roman merchant remembers your port by name, you've officially made it. And speaking of Romans, Axum didn't just take their money, they took their money system too. Around the 3rd century CE, Axum began minting its own coins, and not just any coins, but internationally recognized, high silver content, proudly bilingual coins. One side, Greek, the lingua franca of trade. The other, Georgiae, Axum's own script. This wasn't just currency, it was soft power. It said, we're open for business, we play by global rules, and we can engrave a really good-looking king's head in precious metal. Axumite coins, circulated far and wide. Archaeologists have found them in India, Sri Lanka, Egypt, and even Italy. Some coins bore Christian symbols before the Roman Empire itself fully converted. But hey, that's for another chapter. For now, it's enough to say these coins helped standardize trade, promote Axum's royal image, and make sure the kingdom got paid with interest. But here's the real kicker. Axum didn't rely on military conquest to become rich. It didn't need legions or spears or walls stretching from Scotland to Syria. It relied on location, organization, diplomacy, and supply chain dominance. This wasn't an empire built on blood, it was built on balance sheets and boats. By the 4th century CE, Axum had become a gold-plated, animal-shipping, incense-scented powerhouse. Not just a participant in the ancient world economy, a linchpin, an empire that quietly made a fortune, while others wrote history with swords. The world came to Axum, and left with carts full of elephants and cinnamon. If you had wandered into the city of Axum sometime in the 4th century CE, perhaps slightly lost, mildly sunburned and wondering why there were so many elephants wandering around, you would have seen something astonishing. Stone skyscrapers, royal compounds, underground tombs fit for demigods, and a city pulsing with power. And you might have thought, wait, am I in Africa or an alternate Rome with better landscaping? Welcome to Axum at its absolute zenith, when historians began placing it shoulder to shoulder with Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 great world powers of the era. Not a colony, not a side quest. A legitimate empire with its own swagger, stonework, and diplomatic fan mail from foreign emperors. Let's begin with the architectural flexing, because nothing says I have arrived quite like carving a 100-foot stone obelisk out of a single slab of granite and standing it up in the middle of your capital. Axum didn't just dabble in monumental architecture, it specialized in it. The kingdom's most iconic contribution to ancient aesthetics? The stelae, giant stone pillars that rose from the earth like fingers pointing accusingly at the sun. Some were nearly 30 meters, almost 100 feet tall, intricately decorated with carved windows, false doors, and decorative patterns mimicking multi-story buildings. These weren't tombstones, these were ancient high-rises, complete with underground tombs beneath them to house Axomite royalty and their afterlife accessories. Think gold, weapons, and an unreasonable number of ceramic pots. The largest stela, now toppled and sulking on the ground, is estimated to have weighed over 500 tons. And no, we don't know exactly how they moved it. Aliens? Oxen? Ancient engineers with too much time and ambition? Whatever the method, it worked, and it left a skyline that would have made your average Roman architect weep with envy. But the stelae were just the beginning. Axom's palaces were sprawling stone structures with thick walls, ceremonial halls, and hydraulic systems that made sure even the royal goats stayed hydrated. Beneath the city, multi-chambered tombs hinted at a complex belief system, one where the dead needed a bit more than a simple rest in peace. They needed architecture. Now, if all this sounds like the work of a particularly Type A ruler, you're not wrong. Enter King Ezana, Axom's most famous monarch, sometimes called Africa's Constantine, and not just because they both had a thing for religious transformation. More on that much later. Ezana came to power in the early 4th century CE, and wasted no time stamping his name onto every aspect of the empire, usually in stone inscriptions that declared how excellent he was at running things. And honestly, he kind of was. Under Ezana's reign, Axom expanded its influence across the Red Sea and down into Nubia, crushing rival kingdoms and adding territory like it was on clearance. He centralized administration, standardizing weights, measures, and bureaucratic procedures like an overachieving spreadsheet with a sword. Unlike many empires that ruled through chaos, Ezana's Axom ran like a well-oiled, camel-powered machine. He also left behind a surprising amount of inscribed documentation, the ancient world's version of Pix or It Didn't Happen. These inscriptions, often trilingual in Ge'ez Greek and Sabarin, served as both royal brag sheets and diplomatic communiques. In them, Ezana talks about military victories, gifts to temples, and in a truly peak king move, refers to himself as King of Kings, and the world noticed. Roman sources such as the historian Rufinus mention Axom as a serious player. Even Persian chroniclers acknowledged Axom's power, sometimes begrudgingly, because let's face it, having a wealthy, well-governed empire across the sea with an increasingly confident attitude was slightly annoying to empires that thought they had a monopoly on greatness. What made Axom stand out was how it handled cultural sophistication alongside imperial muscle. It wasn't just fighting and building, it was also organizing festivals, maintaining court rituals, and sponsoring a literary and artistic tradition that included everything from royal inscriptions to intricate carvings and ceremonial objects. It was an empire where military commanders and priests probably argued over temple layouts, a place where the royal court may have had strong opinions on music, incense, and how exactly to serve lentils at banquets. And let's not forget the sheer confidence of it all. This was a kingdom that didn't just want to participate in global power politics. It wanted to leave a stone-carved resume declaring, "We were here, we were mighty, and by the way, our tombs are nicer than your palaces." In fact, centuries later, when Mussolini's troops occupied Ethiopia, they were so impressed or envious of Axom's architectural legacy that they literally stole one of the stelae and shipped it to Rome, a theft that wouldn't be rectified until 2005, when it was finally returned in pieces, like a very delayed Amazon delivery. So yes, when historians describe Axom as the Rome of Africa, they're not being metaphorical. They're acknowledging a politically advanced, culturally complex, and monumentally ambitious empire that stood tall, literally and figuratively, at a time when much of the world had never even heard of it. Next time you hear someone claim Africa had no great civilizations before colonialism, feel free to point to Axom and then drop a granite stela on that ignorance. Long before Constantine gazed up at the sky and saw his famous cross-shaped vision, before cathedrals pierced European skylines, and before monks began copy-pasting the Bible by candlelight, There was a king in East Africa who made a choice that would ripple through history. His name was Ezana. His kingdom was Axom, and he wasn't just flirting with Christianity, he went all in. Yes, you read that right. Axom beat Europe to the punch. In the 4th century CE, this African empire became one of the first in the world to officially adopt Christianity as the state religion. While the Roman Empire was still deciding whether Christians were a threat, a curiosity, or an odd cult that refused to sacrifice to statues, Axom was already setting up churches and engraving crosses on its coins. But like all great historical moments, this one didn't happen overnight. It started, oddly enough, with a shipwreck, because in ancient times, divine plans often came wrapped in very wet, inconvenient packaging. Sometime in the early 300s CE, a Christian merchant ship from the Roman Eastern Mediterranean got blown way off course and wrecked off the coast of the Red Sea. Among the survivors were 2 Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Odysseus, who were promptly scooped up by local authorities and presented to the Axomite royal court. Instead of being sacrificed or turned into court jesters, the brothers impressed everyone with their literacy, diplomacy, and general refusal to panic in the face of foreign customs. In time, they were appointed as tutors to the royal children, including young Ezana himself. Imagine that. One of the future Christian world's first monarchs got homeschooled by shipwrecked Syrians. It's basically the plot of a biblical Disney film that never got made. Frumentius in particular was a theological powerhouse in the making. As Ezana matured, Frumentius began sowing the seeds of Christian doctrine, sprinkling in just enough divine inspiration between lessons on statecraft and the difference between a treaty and a thinly veiled threat. By the time Ezana reached adulthood, his spiritual foundation had been quietly cemented, and once he took the throne, he did something radical. He officially declared Axom a Christian kingdom, but Frumentius didn't stop there. With Ezana's blessing, he traveled north to Alexandria, one of the early strongholds of Christianity, to request formal clergy be sent to help convert and organize Axom's growing faithful. The Patriarch of Alexandria, moved by either divine will or geopolitical strategy, probably both, appointed Frumentius as the first bishop of Axom. Cue the moment where a shipwrecked foreigner becomes Saint Frumentius, apostle of the Ethiopians. That's career advancement for you. And just like that, Christianity wasn't a foreign idea anymore. It became Axomite policy, ritual and identity. But Axom didn't just cut and paste Roman Christianity. No, it blended the new faith with local traditions, creating a spiritual flavor as distinct as the coffee beans that would one day grow in its soil. Local Axomite beliefs, which had long included reverence for celestial forces, sacred trees and ancestral spirits, weren't discarded. They were woven into the Christian story in a way that felt natural. Saints absorbed the aura of local protectors. Rituals were held at sacred sites that predated Christianity. The result was a religious culture that was deeply Christian, yet proudly Ethiopian. It was during this time that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church began to truly take form, not as a Roman offshoot, but as its own self-contained spiritual powerhouse. Unlike the emerging churches in the West, Ethiopia's church would remain under the spiritual jurisdiction of the Coptic Patriarch of Alexandria for centuries, yet it maintained its own language, ge'ez, liturgy, and rituals. It became a national church in every sense, by the people, for the people, and frequently chanted in an octave that could wake the dead. Church building became a royal priority. Early Axomite churches were constructed with the same ambition as the stelae of earlier generations, but with cross-shaped floor plans, stone altars, and frescoed walls depicting biblical scenes with a uniquely African flair. Artists began painting angels with dark skin and afros, not as a political statement, but because they were painting what they knew, and frankly, the angels looked cooler that way. Christian symbols began appearing everywhere, crosses etched into coins, carved into walls, and worn as jewelry. This wasn't just symbolism, it was a branding campaign for salvation. Axom declared itself to heaven and earth, "We follow Christ and we're not quiet about it." The move had consequences. Axom's Christian identity deepened its diplomatic ties with Byzantium, but also complicated relationships with Arabian and Persian neighbors, many of whom were increasingly leaning into Zoroastrianism or Islam. But for Axom, the decision to become a Christian empire was never about political expediency. It was a spiritual commitment that would outlast the kingdom itself. And here's the kicker. While many early Christian nations would eventually fracture, fade, or be absorbed, the Christian tradition planted by Frumentius in the 4th century continues to this day. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world, with chants, rituals, and liturgies that stretch back 1,500 years and zero need to consult Rome. So the next time someone tells you Christianity spread west to east, feel free to gently correct them. In Axom, it sailed in on a shipwreck and grew into an empire. At its height, the Kingdom of Axom was more than just a local powerhouse. It was a diplomatic, military, and economic player with a passport that seemed to be stamped by half the known world. For a kingdom nestled in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, Axom punched far above its geographic weight, keeping up with the likes of Rome, Persia, and Byzantium. But being a major player comes with a major problem. The world has a habit of changing the rules mid-game. Let's start with Axom's A-list connections. You know how modern nations flex by showing off their G20 invites? Well, Axom was corresponding with the Byzantine emperors back when Europe was still trying to remember how plumbing worked. Letters were exchanged between Axomite kings and the emperors of Constantinople, particularly during the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. These weren't just polite hellos, they were messages about diplomacy, religion, trade, and sometimes joint interest in keeping a certain part of the world from falling apart. It wasn't just the Byzantines either. Axom had its diplomatic fingers in several pies. Coins minted by the kingdom have been found as far afield as India, Sri Lanka, and even parts of modern China. These were not the kind of tourist trinkets you drop in a fountain and forget. They were real currency used in exchange for spices, silk, and precious stones. In fact, ancient Chinese records mention a mysterious African land sending gifts and envoys, likely referring to Axom. And then there was Axom's influence over the Red Sea. Picture this. The Red Sea was the superhighway of the ancient world. Whoever controlled it didn't just own the water. They controlled what moved between east and west. Axom's position along this vital artery gave it leverage that was less about brute force and more about strategic chokeholds. If goods were going to move between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, they likely passed through Axomite hands. But Axom wasn't content just waving at ships from the shore. In the 6th century CE, the kingdom pulled off one of its boldest geopolitical moves. It invaded southern Arabia. Yes, you read that right. The Axomites launched a cross-Red Sea campaign and temporarily took control of the Himyarite kingdom in what is now Yemen. This wasn't just a flex, it was a full-on play for domination of both sides of the Red Sea, essentially making Axom the gatekeeper of Afro-Arabian trade. The backstory here involves religion, politics, and revenge, a truly ancient power cocktail. The Himyarite ruler, Yusuf Asar-du-Nuas, had persecuted Christians in the region, prompting a dramatic response from Axom's Christian king Caleb. Backed by Byzantium, Caleb's forces crossed the sea and toppled Du-Nuas. Axom installed a puppet regime and essentially ran Yemen from across the waves. For a moment it looked like Axom had figured out how to become a continental empire without needing to conquer the known world. Just the trade routes would do nicely. But power built on trade is always hostage to winds of change, and in this case, the winds were coming from the Arabian Peninsula. The rise of Islam in the 7th century was a seismic shift in every possible way. Within decades, Arab forces controlled the vast majority of the former Roman eastern provinces, Persia, and most crucially for Axom, the Red Sea and its surrounding coasts. Suddenly, the Christian kingdom that had once sent armies across the sea found itself cut off from its former partners. As Islamic caliphates expanded, Axom's access to global trade routes shrank. No more friendly boatloads of goods from Byzantium, no more control of the Arabian ports, and no more global marketplace where Axom called the shots. It wasn't a military defeat that brought Axom's influence down a notch. It was more like a slow diplomatic strangulation. As new trade centers rose under Islamic rule, places like Mecca, Medina, and later Cairo, Axom's commercial relevance declined. Port cities that once buzzed with multilingual chatter and spice-scented coins grew quiet. With the Red Sea increasingly dominated by Arab traders and Islamic empires, Axom went from being the bouncer at the VIP section to the guy standing outside wondering why his name's no longer on the list. And here's where the irony hits hardest. Despite being one of the first Christian kingdoms in the world, Axom was surprisingly tolerant and even helpful toward early Muslims. According to Islamic tradition, when a group of Muhammad's followers fled persecution in Mecca, they found refuge in Axom, where the king, or negus, offered them safety and respect. And yet that same goodwill did not guarantee Axom a permanent seat at the geopolitical table. As the rest of the world began to pivot toward Islamic trade networks and rising Islamic caliphates, Axom's sphere of influence steadily shrank. Diplomatically, economically, and even culturally, the kingdom became more insular, retreating from the global stage it once commanded with ease. But don't call it a full decline, at least not yet. Axom may have been shoved to the sidelines, but its legacy didn't just vanish. Its cultural and religious fingerprints remained embedded in the Horn of Africa. What it lost in ports and coins, it would soon gain in spiritual depth, architectural wonder, and cultural endurance, but we'll get to that. For now, remember this. Axom wasn't just some forgotten kingdom in a dusty corner of a map. It played the global game, and for a time it played it well enough to influence 3 continents. But the world is a wheel, and when it turns, even mighty empires must decide whether to adapt, retreat, or fade into legend. Some nations boast of their monuments, others their military triumphs. Ethiopia's ancient Kingdom of Axom, it might just be home to the single most sought-after religious relic in Judeo-Christian history, the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, that Ark, the gold-covered wooden chest allegedly containing the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments. You know, the one Indiana Jones fought Nazis for. But unlike Hollywood's version, the Ethiopian story is less about explosions and more about ancient epics, sacred secrets, and a church that guards a mystery behind closed curtains. Let's start at the heart of the legend, the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, located in the modern town of Axom, northern Ethiopia. This humble yet heavily guarded church isn't just any religious site. It is claimed to be the resting place of the Ark itself, not a replica, not a symbolic gesture. The actual chest Moses dragged down Mount Sinai, which leveled walls and terrified the Philistines. According to tradition, it sits inside a special chapel, watched over day and night by a single chosen guardian monk. His job, protect the Ark. His reward, eternal devotion and total seclusion. He is forbidden from ever leaving the church compound for the rest of his life. And no one else, not even the patriarch of the Ethiopian church, is allowed to lay eyes on it. The legend of how the Ark ended up in Axom comes from an ancient Ethiopian text called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings. This 14th century epic isn't just some dusty religious tale, it's the national myth of Ethiopia, combining biblical figures, royal bloodlines, and geopolitical ambition. According to the story, the Queen of Sheba, a figure celebrated in both the Bible and the Quran, visited King Solomon in Jerusalem. The encounter was, let's say, memorable. She returned to her homeland pregnant with Solomon's child, Menelik I. Years later, Menelik would travel to Jerusalem to meet his father, but when he returned home he didn't come back empty-handed. The story claims he or one of his entourage stole the Ark, allegedly with divine blessing, and brought it back to Ethiopia, where it's remained ever since. While most historians treat this claim with skepticism, for many Ethiopians, it's more than a tale. It's spiritual truth and national pride rolled into one. And Axom hasn't exactly tried to hide its devotion. Pilgrims come from across Ethiopia to visit the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, even though they won't get within arm's reach of the Ark. During the Timkit festival, a celebration of the Epiphany, sacred replicas of the Ark called tabots are paraded through the streets, accompanied by chants, drums, and holy water. It's a vibrant, colourful, and deeply moving display of how tightly woven the Ark is into the fabric of Ethiopian Christian identity. But it's not just locals who are intrigued. Over the centuries, the Axom-Ark connection has fascinated scholars, adventurers, conspiracy theorists, and clergymen alike. European explorers in the 19th and 20th centuries wrote breathlessly about the legend. Graham Hancock's book, The Sign and the Seal, 1992, reignited international interest, claiming the Ark's journey followed a very real historical trail, ending in Axom. The book was controversial to say the least, but undeniably captivating. Of course, one cannot ignore the irony. While Axom's Ark has never been seen by outside eyes, that's precisely what makes it so compelling. Is it really there? A wooden chest thousands of years old would be astonishing enough on its own, regardless of whether it once hummed with divine lightning. But with no photographs, no carbon dating, and just one secretive monk as witness, the Ark's power lies less in verification and more in faith, mystery, and myth. Interestingly, even the Vatican has never made a serious move to verify the claim, perhaps because to do so would risk breaking a sacred trust, or because the potential to confirm or debunk the story might unravel centuries of belief. In many ways, Axom's Ark is a paradox, an invisible cornerstone of identity. Whether real or symbolic, its existence fuels religious conviction and national pride to this day. And beyond religion, the Ark's legend adds another layer to Axom's historical prestige. While other ancient kingdoms faded into obscurity, with little more than broken ruins and unreadable inscriptions, Axom kept one foot in spiritual relevance, with a secret that continues to lure the imagination of the world. In a world obsessed with proving everything, Axom's Ark remains a monument to the power of not knowing, the quiet, sacred thrill of a story whispered through centuries, told with reverence and protected by those who believe. Whether it sits behind that curtain or not, the legend of the Ark is deeply embedded in the soul of Ethiopia, and it's not giving up its secrets anytime soon. For centuries, the Kingdom of Axom towered over northeast Africa like one of its famed stelae, majestic, immovable, and proud. But even the mightiest stone eventually wears down, and just as quickly as Axom rose to international prominence, it began to slip away, not with a bang but with a gradual muffled sigh that echoed through the centuries. While Rome's fall was marked by sacks and swordplay, Axom's decline crept in through drought, dust, and quiet geopolitical sidelining. Let's start with something surprisingly modern: climate change. Yes, even in late antiquity, weather had a nasty habit of ruining civilizations. Axom was heavily reliant on agriculture, and at its peak, its highland environment was lush and fertile, perfect for growing grain, raising livestock, and feeding a growing empire. But over time, the region experienced severe deforestation and over-farming. This wasn't some sudden catastrophe, but a long, slow leaching of nutrients from the soil. As forests were cleared for farmland and firewood, and the same plots were cultivated year after year, the land began to fail. Erosion washed away topsoil, rainfall patterns shifted, and droughts became more frequent. The once reliable harvests faltered. Food insecurity hit hard. No empire thrives when its granaries are empty, and a weakened agricultural base meant a weakened economy, lower tax revenues, and more internal instability. It's hard to maintain a trading empire when half your people are worried about dinner. And then there was the geopolitical earthquake. The 7th century ushered in a revolution across the Red Sea, the rise of Islam. As the Islamic Caliphate swept across the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa, they brought not just religion but also an iron grip on trade routes. Axom had once been the gatekeeper to the Red Sea, a vital link in the international shipping chain that connected Rome, India, Africa, and Arabia. Now, it was pushed aside like yesterday's merchant. Muslim merchants began to dominate the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, establishing new networks that bypassed Axom entirely. Previously, ships from the Mediterranean world might have docked at Axumite ports to offload amphorae of wine or pick up ivory and frankincense. But as new Islamic ports rose in importance, places like Aden and Jeddah, Axum found itself edged out of the maritime VIP lounge. Without that trade income, its global influence withered. Its coins, once stamped with kings and crosses and traded as far as India, stopped circulating. As its lowland cities and Red Sea ports became less viable, the Axumite elite began to retreat inland and uphill. Literally, political power shifted toward the northern highlands, where the climate was more forgiving, and the terrain offered natural protection. These highlands would later become the heartland of Ethiopian Christianity. But for Axum, it was more like a graceful backstage exit. The central government fragmented. Kings still ruled, but over smaller and smaller territories. To outside observers, the once great kingdom seemed to simply vanish. Greek and Roman chroniclers stopped mentioning it. Indian traders no longer visited. Even the Islamic chroniclers, once wary of Axum's Christian fleets, lost interest. For centuries, Axum slipped under the radar, known only to the local people who still revered its churches and stelae, even if they no longer controlled an empire. Yet what's remarkable is not just Axum's decline, but its legacy. Most empires that fall leave behind rubble and resentment. Axum left behind stone monuments that still stand today, and a religious tradition that would evolve into one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world. Its political legacy morphed and survived through the Zagwe and Solomonic dynasties that would rise in the highlands centuries later. Even in decline, it shaped the future. In the end, Axum didn't crash, it dimmed. Slowly, subtly, and without fanfare. The world stopped sending ships to its ports. Its kings lost their coin mints. Its people turned to the hills, and the once booming capital became a quiet town of pilgrims, myths and memory. But perhaps that's the final trick of Axum. It declined just enough to disappear from global maps, but not from history. It stepped into the shadows, only to cast a very long one. Today, the ancient kingdom of Axum lies quiet beneath the sun-baked soils of northern Ethiopia, a ghost of its former glory, but one that still whispers its story through towering stelae, church chants, and half-buried secrets. The city of Axum, once a thriving hub of commerce and imperial ambition, has become a paradox, both sacred pilgrimage site and archaeological puzzle, sacred soil and international enigma. Let's start with the stelae, those iconic granite obelisks that stand like bookmarks in the pages of lost history. Some reach over 20 meters high, intricately carved with doors and windows to mimic multi-story palaces. They weren't just decorative. These megaliths likely served as royal grave markers, monuments of power meant to dazzle and intimidate. Their size and craftsmanship remain astonishing even today. One stela, a 24-meter giant weighing over 150 tons, was transported to Rome by Mussolini's forces in 1937 during Italy's occupation of Ethiopia. It stood near the Circus Maximus for nearly 70 years before being returned to Ethiopia in 2005, an act that was part restitution, part geopolitical mea culpa. It now rests back in Axum, re-erected near its ancestral stone siblings, and yet for all the visible grandeur, much of Axum still lies tantalizingly hidden beneath the earth. Excavations have revealed royal tombs, ancient inscriptions, and elaborate foundations, but archaeologists believe we've only scratched the surface. Political instability in the region has hampered further digs, and it's likely that beneath the modern town, entire wings of Axum's imperial past remain buried like unopened letters. Above ground, however, the legacy of Axum is very much alive in Ethiopia's culture and faith. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a direct descendant of the state religion adopted by King Ezana in the 4th century, continues to thrive. The rituals, liturgies, and calendar of the church are infused with ancient customs, many predating Christianity itself. Step into a church service in Axum, and you're stepping into a time capsule, incense curling in the air, priests in elaborate robes chanting ge'ez, an ancient liturgical language that has long vanished from daily speech but remains alive in religious tradition. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion still stands as the spiritual heart of the city, though better known for the Ark of the Covenant legends, covered in the previous chapter. It also represents an unbroken religious lineage dating back over 1,600 years. Pilgrims come from across the country to venerate the site, and festivals like Timket, Epiphany, draw enormous crowds. These celebrations are not only religious in nature, they're cultural memory made public, proof that Axom is more than ruins. It is remembered, revered, and lived. UNESCO recognized this in 1980 by designating the archaeological sites of Axom as a World Heritage Site. This was a nod to its historical significance, as well as an international reminder that African civilizations were global players long before European colonial maps even existed. The site's listing includes not just the famous stele field, but also tombs, palace ruins, and rock-hewn churches, all of which add up to a kind of silent autobiography written in stone. And still, mysteries abound. Scholars debate the exact reasons for Axom's decline, the locations of missing royal palaces, and whether more stellar fields remain undiscovered. Some even suggest that the remains of key figures, perhaps even Menelik I, the legendary son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, could lie beneath the city, waiting for archaeologists brave enough and funded enough to dig deeper. But these ghosts of greatness don't just linger in artifacts. They echo in Ethiopia's enduring sense of identity. Axom is not a forgotten relic, it is a cornerstone of national pride. It's taught in schools, invoked in politics, and etched into Ethiopia's very flag, where the Star of Solomon nods to the legendary origins of its royal bloodline. Even in modern conflict, Axom remains symbolically important, as seen in recent clashes in the Tigray region, where the city's heritage became both a casualty and a rallying cry. So what remains of Axom? A city of stones that once whispered to the heavens, a spiritual lineage that still sings in ancient tongues, and a story that, though long buried, continues to pulse beneath the feet of pilgrims, historians, and the curious few willing to listen. Let's face it, if Axom had been located on the banks of the Danube instead of the Horn of Africa, it would probably have had a TV series, a video game franchise, and at least one Broadway musical by now. Instead, this once mighty African empire builder of obelisks, possessor of the Ark allegedly, and trader with empires halfway across the world, gets little more than a footnote in global textbooks, if it's mentioned at all. So why don't more people know about Axom? One of the biggest culprits, a worldview that decided European events were the main plot and everything else was just background noise. Western historical narratives, especially those developed during the 19th and early 20th centuries, often placed Europe at the center of civilization, with everyone else supposedly playing catch-up. In this framework, African history was often either ignored or simplified into colonial caricatures, tribal, undeveloped, waiting for civilization. Axom, inconveniently for this view, was a literate Christian empire-building society that traded with Rome while Northern Europe was still figuring out how to build huts that didn't leak. But that didn't quite fit the Eurocentric narrative, so snip snip, out of the syllabus it went. When African history is included in mainstream education, it's usually Egypt and not much else. Pharaohs, pyramids, and papyrus scrolls have long held the spotlight, leaving entire continents worth of history in the dark. Egypt has the glamour, the mummies, the Louvre exhibitions. Axom, less so, no surviving golden tombs, no preserved hieroglyphics on sarcophagi, and no blockbuster museum heists. It also doesn't help that much of Axom's history is written in Ge'ez, a language most global scholars never learn, and that oral tradition, while vibrant, was long dismissed as less valid than parchment or papyrus. Add the Cold War into the mix and the problem gets frostier. During the mid-20th century, Ethiopia found itself caught between rival global powers and internal revolutions. Archaeological work slowed to a crawl. Western academic institutions had little incentive or political ease to send scholars to dig up Axomite ruins when there were proxy wars and ideological battles closer to home. The African continent in general suffered a kind of academic blackout during the Cold War, with many historical discoveries postponed, underfunded, or simply ignored. But the tide is turning. In recent decades, scholars have begun to reassess the global history curriculum and ask, wait, what about the rest of the world? Axom has started making appearances in university courses, history documentaries, and academic journals. New digs have revealed everything from ancient coins to temple remains that further complicate the idea that Africa was without history. The Axomite Empire proves that great civilizations aren't confined to latitude or language. It built monumental architecture, developed a written script, established international diplomacy, and spread one of the world's major religions. And it did all of this while Rome was still debating togas versus tunics. Axom isn't just some dusty footnote in the margins of history. It's a glowing headline that's been buried under centuries of misunderstanding and disinterest. So the next time someone rattles off a list of the ancient world's great powers, Rome, Persia, China, Egypt, add one more, Axom. It's time the world rewrites its syllabus and puts Ethiopia's golden empire back where it belongs, center stage. Before there were hipster baristas swirling latte art like Renaissance painters, before office workers clutched paper cups like lifelines, and even before coffee was something you could accidentally spill on your laptop, there were goats, really hyper goats. Our caffeinated tale begins in the misty, mountainous highlands of Ethiopia, around the 9th century, or at least that's the legend. Enter Kaldi, a goat herder, who one day noticed something strange. His usually chill goats were bouncing around like toddlers at a birthday party sponsored by Red Bull. These weren't your average frolics either. We're talking synchronized goat parkour on cliff edges and a full-blown goat rave at sunset. The culprit? A shrubby little plant bearing red berries. Curious and perhaps in dire need of goat-calming intervention, Kaldi tried the berries himself. Cue wide eyes, jittery limbs, and perhaps the first ever involuntary jazz hands in history. Word of Kaldi's discovery supposedly made its way to a nearby monastery, where monks tried brewing the berries into a drink. They quickly realized it helped them stay awake through long night prayers. Divine inspiration? Maybe. Divine caffeine? Definitely. Now, historians are quick to point out that there's zero solid evidence Kaldi ever existed. But hey, when it comes to origin stories, you could do worse than a goat rave in the Ethiopian mountains. While Kaldi's story may be more legend than ledger, there is ample evidence that coffee plants are native to Ethiopia, and that the locals were using them long before the world caught on. Early Ethiopians didn't start with a venti cold brew, of course. Instead, they often chewed on coffee berries for a quick energy boost, like a natural espresso gummy. Some ground the beans and mixed them with animal fat to make snack balls for long journeys, primitive energy bars, minus the pretentious packaging. Eventually, someone got the bright idea to roast the beans and brew them into a drink. This may have happened in the Kingdom of Kaffa, yes, where the name coffee might come from, with the roasting fire crackling and the air filling with that now unmistakable aroma. An ancient miracle was born. The hot, dark, slightly bitter beverage that would go on to power empires, spark revolutions, and ruin bedtimes worldwide. In Ethiopia, coffee is far more than a jolt of wake-up juice. It's a ritual, a ceremony, and above all, a social glue. Enter the Ethiopian coffee ceremony, a beautiful, slow, intentional process that makes your 5-minute French press look like fast food. The ceremony begins with green coffee beans roasted in a pan over open flames. The host, often a woman dressed in traditional attire, wafts the rich smoke toward guests for them to inhale. It's part of the sensory experience, a fragrant welcome mat made of roasted dreams. Next, the beans are ground, traditionally with a mortar and pestle, and brewed in a jebena, a graceful round-bellied clay pot with a long spout. The coffee is poured in a high, elegant arc into tiny cups arranged on a tray, and served in 3 rounds, abel, toner, and baraka. Each round carries its own symbolic meaning, with the final cup, baraka, blessing the drinker. Imagine if your local cafe served blessings with your macchiato instead of passive-aggressive misspellings of your name. This ceremony isn't just about drinking coffee, it's about connection, family, neighbors, friends gathering to sip, talk, and exist in each other's presence without Wi-Fi. It's a space for storytelling, negotiations, gossip, and wisdom sharing, all wrapped around a steaming cup. From its earliest uses, coffee wasn't just fuel, it was hospitality. Offering a guest coffee in Ethiopia is a sign of warmth, trust, and respect. It's a way of saying, sit down, let's share life. And the cup? Not just a vessel, but a symbol. It held more than liquid, it held intention. Long before to-go cups with motivational slogans, the original coffee cups were handcrafted clay or ceramic, small enough to force you to savor every sip. No triple-shot nonsense here. It was slow, deliberate, and respectful, qualities that, let's be honest, most of us could stand to reintroduce into our caffeine consumption. The idea of the coffee cup as a social artifact, as important as the drink itself, starts here. In Ethiopia's communal traditions, the cup didn't separate people. It brought them together. Even today, many Ethiopians view the act of drinking coffee as an invitation to build relationships. In a world of solo commutes and one-handed phone scrolling, that's pretty revolutionary. Long before coffee became a lifestyle brand or your best excuse for avoiding small talk before 9 a.m., it was stirring up intellectual revolutions, religious controversies, and the occasional government crackdown in the Islamic world. By the 15th century, the humble coffee bean had already packed its bags and left Ethiopia, traveling eastward across the Red Sea into Yemen. And there, in the highlands, it found its second home. While Ethiopia may have given the world coffee, Yemen turned it into a movement. In the Sufi monasteries of Yemen, monks used coffee to stay awake during late-night prayers. Picture it. A silent room, dimly lit by oil lamps, with robed mystics sipping a dark, earthy brew from ceramic cups. Alert, eyes gleaming, spiritual engines revving. This wasn't just about staying awake. Coffee helped them reach heightened states of devotion. The drink wasn't a mere beverage, it was a liquid ladder to God. And it didn't take long for the public to get curious. If the monks were sipping something that kept them awake and chanting for hours, perhaps it could also help merchants, scholars, and students get through their own long nights, minus the chanting, or maybe not, depending on how strong the coffee was. Soon enough, coffee made its way to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And with it came the real innovation, the coffee house, known as Cafe Khane. These establishments began popping up across urban centers. Unlike the taverns of Europe, noisy dens of alcohol-fueled brawls and dice rolling, these were places of calm, conversation, and caffeination. Here, men gathered not just to drink but to think. Coffee houses became a meeting ground for scholars, poets, merchants, and the chronically curious. You could walk into one and overhear a heated debate on theology at one table, poetry being recited at another, and someone in the corner whispering about a political scandal involving a vizier and a goat, all over tiny ceramic cups, perfectly sized for sipping and sharing. It's important to understand the role of the cup here, not just the coffee. The ceramic coffee cup wasn't a throwaway item, it was a statement, crafted with care. Often ornately decorated with calligraphy or glazed patterns, these cups were tokens of sophistication. The act of serving coffee in a fine cup was as much about social grace as it was about flavor. These vessels sat at the center of conversations that shaped entire intellectual movements. If the printing press democratized knowledge in Europe, then the coffee cup did something similar in the Islamic world. It became a symbol of ideas shared, arguments refined, and perspectives exchanged. As the drink spread northward, it hit the cultural jackpot in the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul, then Constantinople, embraced the coffee house with the enthusiasm of a city that realized something revolutionary had just landed in their lap and in their cup. Here, the coffee house became an institution. Picture elaborately decorated interiors, cushions strewn across the floor, musical performances, and poets spinning verses on love, war, and coffee itself. Scribes read aloud the day's news, and shadow puppet shows brought satire to life. The coffee cup had officially become the microphone of the Middle East, small, hot, and full of opinions. The Ottomans loved their coffee houses so much that they began to regulate them. Some houses specialized in chess matches and board games, others in news and gossip. You weren't just buying a drink, you were buying access to a communal brain. But of course, when people gather and start thinking, governments start sweating. Sultans began to realize these coffee houses were more than just quaint little hangouts. They were places where criticism was brewed alongside the coffee. When poetry starts sounding suspiciously like sedition, rulers take notice. As a result, coffee houses were banned repeatedly. In the 16th century, Sultan Murad IV, whose mood probably could have been improved with a cup of coffee, launched a crackdown on them. He believed they fostered idleness, rebellion, and dangerous laughter. Coffee drinkers were beaten, fined, and in some cases executed. Secret coffeehouse societies began to form underground, the caffeine version of a speakeasy. Of course, these bans never lasted. Coffee was simply too beloved, and the cup too entrenched in the social fabric. Within a few years, coffee houses were back, and even more popular than before. By the end of the 16th century, the coffee house had become the heart of many Islamic cities. It was the Wi-Fi-free, caffeine-powered analog version of Reddit, Twitter, and the university seminar all rolled into one. It was where you went to learn, to laugh, to argue, to dream. The coffee cup, small, elegant, often passed hand to hand, was at the center of it all. So next time you sip from your mug and wonder if it's worth the $6 you just paid, remember this. In the Islamic world of the 15th and 16th centuries, a coffee cup wasn't just a drink holder, it was an invitation to a revolution of the mind, and no foam art required. When coffee first arrived on European shores, it wasn't just a new drink, it was a cultural meteor. By the 17th century, this dark, mysterious, slightly bitter liquid had snuck in from the Ottoman Empire, unpacked its bags in Venice, and promptly charmed the powdered wigs off every aristocrat and merchant within sniffing distance. And with it came a curious problem. Europeans didn't know how to drink it. More specifically, what to drink it from. Let's rewind a bit. Coffee's initial stop in Europe was, unsurprisingly, Venice. The Maritime Republic had been doing brisk business with the Islamic world for centuries. Spices, textiles, and exotic goods passed through Venetian docks like gossip through a royal court. So when a bitter, dark beverage popular in the Ottoman Empire made its debut in the 1610s, Venetian merchants raised an eyebrow and a goblet. At first, coffee was medicinal. Apothecaries sold it as a cure for everything from headaches to melancholy, though in retrospect its effect on melancholy probably came from caffeine and not divine intervention. But soon the drink outgrew the apothecary's shelf and started showing up in cafes. The first coffee house in Venice opened in 1645, and suddenly coffee was fashionable and expensive. From Venice, coffee hopped westward. Paris embraced it like a long-lost relative, though the French, being the French, immediately elevated the entire ritual. Coffee wasn't just a beverage, it was a lifestyle. Served in salons, it fueled conversations about literature, politics, and the latest scandal involving powdered wigs and illicit letters. London, meanwhile, took the coffeehouse concept and sprinted with it. By the mid-17th century, hundreds of coffeehouses dotted the city, places where merchants met, news spread, and satire flowed alongside caffeine. These weren't quiet cafes, they were more like hyper-caffeinated debate clubs. Coffee became so entwined with intellectual life that some referred to it as the drink of reason. But amid all this brewing excitement, one awkward issue arose. Europeans didn't have the right cups. Prior to the coffee craze, most Europeans drank their liquids from wooden tankards, metal mugs, or even goblets. These were fine for beer or mead, but coffee presented a new challenge. First, it was piping hot. Metal mugs nearly seared off fingertips, and wood absorbed the smell. Second, coffee wasn't chugged, it was sipped, elegantly, slowly. You couldn't exactly swirl coffee in a flagon like wine in a goblet. And so the porcelain panic began. Europeans had long admired Chinese porcelain. particularly the fine white and blue cups imported by Dutch and Portuguese traders. These delicate, translucent vessels were perfect for hot beverages, heat-resistant, odor-neutral, and frankly, quite pretty. The problem? Europe had no idea how to make them. For decades, porcelain was an exotic luxury, so rare and valuable it was often called white gold. Royal families across Europe hoarded Chinese porcelain like dragons with tasteful dishware. The wealthy displayed entire cabinet of curiosities, rooms filled with imported teacups and saucers, which they barely dared use for fear of breakage. But where there is demand, there is ambition, and occasionally, alchemy. In 1708, a German alchemist named Johann Friedrich Butger, originally hired to try to make literal gold, stumbled into something arguably more profitable, a recipe for European hard-paste porcelain. With the backing of Augustus the Strong of Saxony, Europe's first porcelain factory was established in Meissen. It was the birth of German porcelain, and a brand new European obsession. The French, not to be outdone by the Germans, Quelle Horreur, opened their own porcelain factory in Sèvres in 1740. The designs were exquisite, the colors lavish, and the price tags astronomical. Owning a Sèvres demi-tasse, a tiny handleless porcelain cup, was akin to flaunting your position in the social hierarchy with every sip. Porcelain coffee cups quickly became status symbols. Unlike everyday tableware, these cups were reserved for special guests and ceremonial sipping. Entire sets were made just for display. Not a drop of coffee ever touched their delicate interiors. To serve coffee in porcelain was to say, "I am refined, I am cultured, and I can afford not to burn my hands." The designs also mirrored the European imagination. Mythological scenes, exotic birds, pastoral landscapes, all lovingly painted on a cup that might hold a mere ounce or two of liquid. These weren't mugs, they were miniature galleries. And while most of the lower classes still drank from earthenware or metal, the growing popularity of coffee gradually trickled down. By the late 18th century, porcelain factories began producing more affordable pieces for middle-class homes, still delicate, still refined, but a little less ruinous to one's bank account. What started as a mysterious drink from distant lands now had a permanent place in European kitchens and cafes, and the coffee cup became part of that ritual. Unlike the communal bowls of earlier cultures, Europe's coffee cup was individualistic. Each person received their own, a quiet symbol of autonomy and taste. So next time you cradle your morning latte in that sleek ceramic cup, remember, you're holding the product of centuries of obsession, experimentation, and a mild panic about hot fingers, a little piece of history, delicately fired, glazed, and ready for caffeine. It's a curious thing how many rebellions, revolutions, and radical ideas have been stirred, not in the battlefield, but in a warm ceramic vessel filled with roasted bean juice. While kings were clutching golden goblets and nobles were raising crystal flutes, the real action was happening in dimly lit coffee houses, where people gathered to drink, debate, and dismantle entire political systems one tiny porcelain cup at a time. In both France and the American colonies, the coffee house was less a place of leisure and more a political incubator. In 18th century Paris, for example, you could walk into Café Procope and find yourself shoulder to shoulder with Rousseau, Diderot, or Voltaire, all of whom practically lived there, fueled by caffeine and the thrill of telling monarchs they were doing everything wrong. These weren't just idle conversations between intellectuals, they were dangerous. In an age where the wrong pamphlet could get you guillotined, cafes became safe havens for expressing new revolutionary ideas. Safe, that is, until the sultans, kings, or church caught wind and decided it was time to shut it down. But before the crackdown came the buzz, the mental clarity that only a good, strong coffee could deliver. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American colonists were embracing the coffee house for their own rebellious reasons. In Boston, a group of angry men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded a ship and hurled hundreds of chests of tea into the harbor, in what would become the most famous beverage boycott in history. While this made a soggy mess of British East India profits, it also changed the drinking habits of a nation. Loyalists might still sip their tea in quiet shame, But for the burgeoning patriots, coffee became more than a hot drink. It became a political statement. To drink tea was to side with tyranny. To sip coffee was to toast freedom. In fact, the Boston Tea Party was less about the beverage and more about taxation without representation, but the aftertaste lingered in the form of a cultural shift. Almost overnight, American coffee houses transformed into revolutionary HQs. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, for instance, was less about spirits and more about spirit, where the Sons of Liberty plotted, argued, and occasionally sobered up with a cup of coffee between schemes. Here, over steaming cups, plans were drawn, pamphlets were passed, and protests were born. What made the coffee cup such a potent symbol during this time was not just what it held, but what it represented. Unlike wine, which dulled the senses, or tea, which reeked of British decorum, coffee sharpened the mind. It kept thinkers thinking and doers doing. It was no coincidence that the Enlightenment, a period marked by bold ideas, fierce debate, and unrelenting critique of authority, coincided with coffee's rapid rise in popularity. Where salons glittered with chandeliers and etiquette, coffee houses reeked of tobacco, ink, and democracy. The simple act of sipping from a small ceramic cup became a way of aligning oneself with progress. There were no velvet ropes or powdered wigs required. Anyone who could afford a few coins and a willingness to argue could claim a seat and a say. For the first time, the clatter of cups wasn't just background noise, it was the soundtrack of social change. Even the design of the coffee cup played its part. Porcelain demitases, elegant, handleless, and imported from distant lands, signaled cosmopolitanism. But in the revolutionary coffee houses, simpler mugs reigned. They were sturdy, practical, and built for long hours of scheming. The shift in cup style from dainty to durable mirrored the shift in discourse from philosophical to political, from pondering utopia to demanding action. And while the battles raged on outside, coffee houses continued to provide a relatively neutral ground for revolutionary thinkers. They were the unofficial universities of the age, where no degrees were granted, but worldviews were certainly changed. There, over the gentle steam rising from a cup, liberty was debated, rights were declared, and kings, well, they were metaphorically dethroned long before the mobs arrived at their palaces. The coffee cup may seem a quiet object, nestled harmlessly in your palm, but in the 18th century it was practically a weapon. It was wielded in conversations, raised in protests, and passed around tables as plans were laid for new republics. So next time you sip your morning brew, remember, your mug is the direct descendant of a cup that once held revolution, and unlike swords or muskets, it never had to spill blood to change the world, just a little bit of scalding hot caffeine. The 19th century didn't just bring steam engines, smog, and Dickensian childhoods. It brought an unrelenting need for more speed, more machines, more productivity, and somewhere amid all that clanging metal and black-lunged ambition, coffee became less of a social ritual and more of an industrial necessity. But where coffee went, the cup followed, and as humans found themselves waking earlier, working longer, and staring at more confusing sets of gears than ever before, the humble coffee cup transformed from dainty porcelain aristocrat to rugged ceramic workhorse. Welcome to the era when the coffee mug clocked in. Let's start with a manufacturing miracle, mass production. Before industrialization, ceramic cups were hand-thrown or delicately molded by artisans, painted with the patience of saints, and priced accordingly, meaning only those with powdered wigs and inherited land could afford to sip from them. But with the advent of mechanized pottery factories, cups became cheaper, sturdier, and standardized. Stoke-on-Trent in England became the mug mecca of the world. Factories churned out millions of ceramic cups and mugs, each virtually identical to the next, and all blessedly immune to aristocratic fragility. It wasn't long before every boarding house, rail station, and break room had shelves lined with mass-produced mugs, thick, dependable, and devoid of frills. Of course, with mass production came mass exhaustion. The industrial workday was brutal, and workers needed fuel, not just to keep going, but to survive the early mornings, long shifts, and poor lighting. Enter the workplace coffee break, Employers, not typically known for their generosity in the 1800s, slowly recognized that a caffeinated workforce was a more compliant one. By the early 20th century, some progressive factories had even formalized short coffee breaks into the daily routine, a revolutionary idea that meant two things: a momentary escape from the machines, and the rise of the standardized office mug. The office mug was a curious beast. It was utilitarian, yes, no fine china here, but it also became a kind of industrial companion. Unlike teacups, which sat politely on saucers waiting for conversation, mugs were gripped, gulped, and left with lipstick stains or black coffee rings on paperwork. They were stout and stable, perfect for the quick pace of factory lines and later corporate offices. And as the decades rolled on, these mugs began to develop personality. By the mid-20th century, mugs were no longer just cups, they were branding opportunities. With the explosion of advertising and marketing culture in the post-war era, the humble mug became a walking, or rather desk-sitting, billboard. Companies emblazoned their logos across ceramic surfaces, gave mugs away as promotional items, and even began designing them with clever slogans, inside jokes, and comic strips. "Don't talk to me until I've had my coffee" became less of a warning and more of a design template. The coffee mug had entered the realm of pop culture. You could now gauge a person's entire professional identity based on their mug. The middle manager had "world's best boss." The intern got stuck with a chipped one that said "keep calm and file on." And somewhere in the corner, the guy from IT sipped from a mug shaped like a skull, daring you to ask him about it. These ceramic companions weren't just containers for caffeine, they were morale lifelines, conversation starters, and sometimes passive-aggressive messages to co-workers. At the same time, a new cultural association began to crystallize: the mug as a symbol of both productivity and burnout. In early industrialism, coffee was simply a stimulant, but by the 1980s and beyond, it became a badge of suffering. Running on coffee and deadlines. Caffeine, the other food group. Late-stage capitalism had weaponized the coffee mug. If you weren't sipping from one, were you even working hard enough? The mug sat on desks during all-nighters, cradled by trembling hands during Monday morning meetings, and kept company with vending machine sandwiches during unpaid overtime. It was dependable, it didn't judge, and it could hold enough coffee to trick your brain into thinking sleep was optional. In a way, the mug was the blue-collar hero of the desk job revolution, rarely appreciated, often microwaved, and always present. And so, as industrialization hummed along and modern work became more complex, the mug remained at the center of it all, chipped, stained, sometimes with mysterious contents from last week, but still an anchor in the ever-accelerating world of labor. It wasn't graceful or elegant, but it worked, which, in an industrial society obsessed with output, made it perfect. War may be hell, but it runs on caffeine. By the time World War II ignited the globe, the humble coffee cup had already made itself at home in palaces and parlors alike. But now, it would take on a grittier, more urgent role as a battlefield companion, a morale booster, and a metal-sided symbol of survival. The coffee cup was no longer just a refined ritual of leisure. It became a necessary tool in the kit of war. When soldiers were sent off to fight in the early 1940s, their kits included more than bullets and boots. They needed warmth, alertness, and a few fleeting seconds of comfort, things that often came in the form of powdered instant coffee and a dented tin mug. The military embraced instant coffee with open arms and sleep-deprived eyes. It was easy to transport, lasted forever, or seemed like it, and didn't require a Parisian cafe to prepare. All it needed was boiling water, or at least something vaguely hot and not full of mud. The GI mug became a near-universal artifact of war, usually made from tin, steel, or enamel. It was tough enough to survive a fall from a tank, and deep enough to hold a soldier's caffeine, soup, or on particularly grim days, both at once. Soldiers would often personalize their mugs with scratched-in names, unit numbers, or crude jokes, turning them into little steel journals that documented both the boredom and chaos of war. These mugs weren't just utility items, they were lifelines, Sitting around in cold camps or ducking into makeshift bunkers, soldiers would share stories, pass time, and bond over whatever brew they could cobble together. Coffee wasn't about taste, it was about togetherness. You didn't need a gourmet roast when you were ankle-deep in snow or crawling through North African deserts. You needed something hot, strong, and capable of momentarily masking the horrors of war. That something came in the form of bitter, watery instant coffee, sipped slowly from a mug that rattled like a tambourine whenever a nearby shell landed too close. In Europe, Allied mess halls kept massive percolators running like engines and troops lined up, mugs in hand like worshippers at the altar of caffeine. Across the Pacific, US Marines brewed coffee in jungle camps with rainwater, rusted tins and pure willpower. Even high-ranking officers had their own special mugs, often adorned with military insignia, as though the chain of command extended all the way down to how you held your drink. And then there was the post-war afterglow. When the soldiers came home, many brought their coffee habits with them, and their mugs too. The rugged utility of wartime coffee culture slowly filtered into American kitchens, where people began to favor the same no-nonsense approach to their morning routines. Instant coffee brands like Nescafe and Maxwell House exploded in popularity, riding the wave of nostalgia and convenience. Coffee was no longer something special you enjoyed only at the corner diner. It was a domestic staple, reheated in the same battered mug every morning while the radio hummed and the kids yelled. In fact, the post-war coffee boom was so intense that companies had to radically expand mug production just to keep up. But these weren't delicate porcelain pieces or dainty demitasse cups from elegant salons. These were thick-walled, practical ceramic or glass mugs, sturdy, stackable, and utterly unpretentious. And often their design echoed the no-frills aesthetic of the GI cup, reminding everyone that just a few years earlier, that morning mug might have been the only warmth a soldier had in a foxhole. Veterans returning to school under the GI Bill or entering the workforce became the new coffee evangelists. Their mugs followed them to college campuses, break rooms, and factory floors. They didn't just sip coffee, they started mornings with it, fought deadlines with it, and raised kids who would one day do the same. And beneath all that ceramic and caffeine was the subtle memory of the battlefield, where the first sip of something hot wasn't about flavor or foam, it was about feeling human again. At first glance, a paper coffee cup seems like the least romantic object in the caffeinated kingdom, flimsy, mass-produced, and destined for a landfill. But this humble cylinder of waxed paper and plastic linings tells the story of how modern society came to embrace convenience over ceremony, speed over savoring. The paper cup didn't just hold coffee, it held an era's values, anxieties, and priorities, all sealed with a plastic lid and served with a side of napkins. It all began, fittingly, with public health concerns. In the early 1900s, people still shared tin or ceramic drinking vessels at public water fountains, a rather horrifying detail to modern sensibilities. Enter the health cup, soon renamed the Dixie cup, a single-use paper vessel introduced to curb the spread of germs. While it wasn't born in a cafe, the Dixie cup quickly gained traction beyond the water cooler, especially during a time when disease transmission was a very real, very visible fear. Sanitation had become a selling point, and suddenly a paper cup was no longer cheap, it was smart. Coffee sellers began to see the potential. In cities where life moved fast and mornings were crowded, the idea of takeaway beverages was gaining traction. But it wasn't until after World War II that the real paper cup revolution kicked in. Post-war America was a land enamored with innovation and progress, and that included its breakfast routines. By the 1950s, vending machines could pour hot coffee into paper cups at the push of a button. No saucer, no waiter, no lingering required. It was a modern miracle, caffeine at arm's length. The 1960s brought the true explosion of to-go coffee culture, fueled by the rise of commuting, the growth of cities, and the glorification of the on-the-go lifestyle. The paper cup became an urban icon. In New York, the Anthora cup, blue and white with Greek motifs, and the slogan "We are happy to serve you" became synonymous with morning rush hour. the fuel of taxi drivers, journalists, and Wall Street analysts alike. The cup wasn't just functional, it became a symbol of American hustle, a quiet declaration that you were too busy to sit down, but too smart to skip your morning brew. But with convenience came consequence. As paper cups multiplied by the billions, so did the waste. Most paper cups, coated in polyethylene to prevent leaks, were not truly recyclable. They piled up in landfills, floated in gutters, and clogged waterways. By the late 20th century, environmentalists began sounding the alarm. Our addiction to disposability came with a serious carbon footprint. The coffee-to-go culture, once hailed as modern efficiency, was suddenly under scrutiny. Major coffee chains tried to respond. Starbucks introduced cup recycling programs, reusable mug incentives, and later, compostable cup alternatives. But change was slow. The paper cup remained a stubborn staple, defended by habit, cost, and the deep-rooted appeal of convenience. After all, people weren't just buying coffee, they were buying time, and time, as any overworked commuter can tell you, is priceless. Despite the backlash, the paper cup has proven oddly resilient. In many ways it reflects the paradox of modern life, our desire to be eco-conscious while still living in a world built for speed and disposability. For every reusable tumbler enthusiast, there are dozens of sleepy-eyed students clutching single-use cups as they shuffle to class. The paper cup may be simple, but its legacy is anything but. It has held espresso in Paris, diner drip in Detroit, and pumpkin-spiced concoctions in suburban malls. It's been doodled on, spilled in laps, and photographed on social media. Whether tossed in trash cans or immortalized in coffee shop art, the paper cup has become a cultural artifact, equal parts practical and problematic. In its short, one-sip lifespan, the disposable coffee cup managed to mirror a century's worth of social change. It told the story of how hygiene fears shaped consumption, how cities shaped speed, and how convenience came to define an era. It may be headed for the trash after 15 minutes, but it's already left its mark on history. Once upon a time, your coffee cup was just a cup, something to hold liquid, something to get washed, dried, and probably chipped within a year. But then came a green siren, rising from the caffeine depths of Seattle, and suddenly your humble drinking vessel wasn't just about the drink, it was about you. Enter the Starbucks era, when the coffee cup evolved from ceramic afterthought to international passport, cultural mirror, and occasionally the canvas for your misspelled name. In 1971, Starbucks began as a modest little store selling coffee beans, not lattes with soy foam and your favorite indie podcast playing in the background. But as the company morphed into a global caffeine empire in the 1990s and 2000s, its signature white paper cups, complete with the now famous mermaid logo, became icons in their own right. Holding one meant more than just "I'm drinking coffee." It meant, "I'm on the move, I've got somewhere to be," or even "look at me, I know what a macchiato is." It was portable sophistication for the masses. And then came the names. You handed over your order, and they handed you back a cup with a name that was almost but not quite yours. A Ben became a Bin. Rachel somehow turned into Rachel, and no one ever spelled Sivan correctly in the history of caffeine. What began as a simple way to personalize an order became a running joke, a viral trend, and a point of communal bonding. Millions began photographing their cups, sharing them online, and laughing at their new Starbucks identities. It was free marketing wrapped in frothy comedy. But the coffee cup's new role didn't stop at self-expression. It also became a battleground, not of taste but of sustainability. As the planet began sweating under the pressure of industrial convenience, paper and plastic cups were no longer seen as harmless conveniences. They were symbols of waste, one-time use. Throwaway culture, Starbucks, now a symbol of global consumption, faced the inevitable. Customers wanted caffeine without the guilt. Thus began the reusable revolution. Stainless steel tumblers, collapsible silicone cups, and insulated mugs with cult followings hit the market like hipsters to an oat milk festival. Starbucks and other giants incentivized their use, offering discounts and special designs, and suddenly bringing your own cup wasn't just an eco-conscious move, it was a status symbol. Your reusable cup said, "I care about the environment," or at least I want people to think I do while I Instagram this latte art. This shift toward personal cups mirrored a larger trend in coffee culture: individualism. No longer was the coffee cup just a vehicle for brown liquid, it was an accessory to your identity. Your order was customized, your cup was customized, your caffeine intake was a reflection of your mood, your diet, your worldview. It was a performance, and the cup was the prop. Even the shape and material of your cup said something. Sleek black matte thermos. You probably listen to true crime podcasts and care deeply about font choices. Vintage diner mug with a chipped rim. You're a nostalgic realist with a love of flannel. Bamboo tumbler with a floral sleeve. You compost and can pronounce acai correctly. We laugh, but in the age of curated identities, your coffee cup can genuinely be a more honest self-portrait than your social media bio. And it wasn't just about the customer. Baristas became cultural translators, cup scribblers, and sometimes artists. Cups turned into miniature canvases with doodles, poetry, or gentle life advice scrawled in marker. The act of receiving a cup became an interaction, a moment of connection in an otherwise autopilot morning. The cup became more than a container, it was a message, a mirror, and occasionally a motivational poster. In the 21st century, the coffee cup transformed from anonymous utility to personal artifact. It's been branded, parodied, protested, and photographed more times than most pop stars. And in the ever-churning tide of global culture, the Starbucks-era cup reflects the strange, caffeinated world we live in, where we crave connection, comfort, and just the right temperature for our almond milk latte. It's just a cup, right? A vessel, a container, a glorified scoop with a handle. And yet somehow, this humble object has not only survived the centuries, but shaped them. In fact, if aliens ever try to decode the rise and fall of human civilization, they might do well to start with the coffee cup, chipped, ring-stained, and still sitting proudly on every desk from Delhi to Des Moines. Let's start with the cultural clout. You've seen it. You've lived it. That morning ritual, the bleary-eyed shuffle toward the kettle, the hiss of the espresso machine, the sacred silence as the first sip hits. Across continents and calendars, the coffee cup has become a universal symbol of "please don't talk to me yet." But this is more than caffeine worship. The cup itself is a signal, a talisman of transition from sleep to productivity, chaos to routine. For millions, it's a psychological switch that flips the brain from idle to let's pretend to be functional. Yet this little object's influence goes far beyond kitchens and cubicles. The coffee cup has been a participant, silent but ever present in the great dramas of human society. In workplaces, it's helped fuel the 9-to-5 grind and lubricate awkward break-room small talk. In politics, it's sat next to presidents, radicals, and revolutionaries alike, as policies were hammered out over steaming brews. And in creativity, it has been a muse. Writers have stared into it, painters have immortalized it, filmmakers have used it to set the tone. Think of every moody noir detective nursing a chipped mug of black coffee at a greasy diner, or every indie protagonist holding a ceramic cup while contemplating life's meaning in a rain-drenched cityscape. Take literature, for instance. The coffee cup is everywhere, not as a prop, but as punctuation. It marks pauses in dialogue, underlines emotional beats, offers comfort or confrontation. In Ernest Hemingway's minimalist prose or Haruki Murakami's surreal tales, the appearance of a coffee cup is never just caffeine, it's context. In art, too, the cup is iconic. Pop art turned it into branding. Still life painters gave it symbolism. Even Banksy couldn't resist. That lone, half-finished paper cup in a gritty alley can say more about modern life than $100 canvas. And then came the tech age. And because we can't help ourselves, we gave the coffee cup a makeover. Behold the self-heating mug, sleek, battery-powered, and Bluetooth-enabled. It keeps your coffee at the precise temperature your finicky taste buds demand. There are smart cups that tell you how much you've drunk, what time to refill, and how sustainably sourced your brew was. We've somehow turned the most ancient of rituals into a Silicon Valley playground. The irony, despite all this innovation, many of us still cling to that one beat-up mug we've had for a decade, a reminder that sentiment often censors. Of course, not everything about our beloved cup is cause for celebration. There's a shadow side. Billions of disposable cups now clog our landfills and oceans, the collateral damage of modern convenience. And while many have made the switch to reusable mugs, the tension between speed and sustainability continues to simmer. But even this dilemma tells us something. When we argue about coffee cups, we're really arguing about the kind of future we want. Fast or thoughtful, wasteful or wise. And maybe that's the point. The coffee cup has always been more than just a tool. It's a mirror. It reflects the era it's in. In medieval times, it was about hospitality and hierarchy. In Enlightenment Europe, it held the liquid that stirred revolution. During the wars, it was grit and rationed comfort. In the 21st century, it's identity, anxiety, convenience and conscience all at once. So the next time you cradle your cup, ceramic, paper, steel or smart, pause for a second. Think of the centuries behind that sip, the hands that shaped it, the revolutions it's witnessed, the desks, trenches, cafes and cubicles it's seen. And ask yourself, is this just coffee, or is this history in a cup?